Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a complete journey through the remarkable life of Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the Leper King, who defied a devastating disease to become one of the greatest warrior kings of the medieval world. Against all odds, this young monarch protected the holy city from the legendary Saladin, leading armies into battle even as leprosy ravaged his body. Before you drift into peaceful slumber, I'd love to hear from you. Don't be shy. Leave a gentle comment sharing which part of Baldwin's story you find most inspiring, or simply say hello. Your kind words mean the world to our Sleepy Crown family. And if you enjoy these soothing historical journeys, please like this video and subscribe so you never miss a tale. Now, cozy up beneath your softest blanket, close your eyes, and let the gentle whispers of 12th century Jerusalem lull you into restful sleep. Welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Baldwin, later known as Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, entered the world during the warm summer months of 1161, though the exact date of his arrival remains lost to the passage of centuries. The precise location of his birth is similarly uncertain, though most historians believe he first drew breath within the ancient walls of Jerusalem itself, or perhaps in the coastal fortress city of Ascalon, where his father held considerable power and influence. His father was Amalric, Count of Jaffa and Ascalon, a man of formidable reputation who stood among the foremost lords of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. This prominence was hardly surprising, for Amalric belonged to the royal family itself. His own brother wore the crown as King Baldwin III of Jerusalem. The young prince, who would become Baldwin IV, bore the name of this uncle and king, who also stood as godfather at the infant's baptism, performing the sacred duties that bound their lives together in both family and faith. The naming carried weight beyond mere family tradition. In the Crusader kingdoms, names connected generations, linking the present to the glorious past and the hoped-for future. By naming his son Baldwin, Amalric honored both his brother and the legacy of their family's rule over the Holy Land. The ceremony of baptism would have been conducted with all the solemnity befitting a prince of Jerusalem, with holy water blessed by the patriarch himself, surrounded by the great nobles of the realm, who came to witness the continuation of the royal line. Yet the infant Baldwin would never come to know the uncle for whom he was named, never hear stories from the king's own lips, never received the guidance of the man who joked at his christening that his gift to his godson was nothing less than the kingdom of Jerusalem itself. Fate, as it so often does, had different plans. In February of 1163, when young Baldwin was barely 2 years old, King Baldwin III breathed his last, most likely succumbing to complications arising from dysentery, though whispers of poison circulated through the court in hushed, fearful tones. The king died childless at the tragically young age of 33, his reign cut short before he could secure the succession through children of his own. His death opened the way for his brother Amalric to ascend to the throne of Jerusalem, transforming young Baldwin from the nephew of a king to the son of one. This elevation in status would shape every aspect of Baldwin's childhood, though neither he nor anyone else could have known the extraordinary challenges that awaited him. The world into which Baldwin was born was one of extraordinary complexity and constant danger. The kingdom of Jerusalem existed as a Christian realm, carved from lands that had been under Muslim control for centuries, established in the aftermath of the First Crusade's stunning success in capturing the Holy City in 1099. For more than 6 decades, this kingdom and its sister Crusader states had survived through a combination of military prowess, political cunning, and the periodic arrival of fresh crusaders from Western Europe. The kingdom itself was a fascinating blend of Western European feudal traditions and Eastern Mediterranean realities. The ruling class spoke French and maintained the customs of their ancestral homelands, yet they lived among populations of Greek Orthodox Christians, Syrian Christians, Jews and Muslims. The Frankish nobles, as they were called regardless of their actual origins, had adapted to the climate, the architecture, and many of the customs of the Levant, though they remained firmly Western in their core identity and allegiance. Jerusalem, the beating heart of the kingdom, was unlike any city in Western Europe. Its golden stone walls enclosed the holiest sites of Christianity, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built over the site believed to be where Christ was crucified and buried. Pilgrims from across Christendom journeyed to walk where Jesus had walked, to pray where he had prayed, to touch the stones of the Via Dolorosa. The city buzzed with a dozen languages, its markets filled with goods from as far away as India and the African interior. But this Christian kingdom existed in a state of perpetual precariousness. It was surrounded on nearly all sides by Muslim powers, who viewed the Crusader presence as an affront to Islam and a wound that needed to be healed. The great Muslim cities of Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo all lay within relatively close proximity, each capable of fielding armies that could threaten the existence of the Crusader states. The rulers of Jerusalem knew that their survival depended on keeping their Muslim neighbors divided, on maintaining the walls and castles that dotted the landscape, and on ensuring that reinforcements continued to arrive from Europe. Young Baldwin's grandfather, Fulk of Anjou, had been one of these Western nobles who came east to marry into royalty and eventually became king himself. His grandmother, Melisande, was one of the most remarkable women of her age, a queen who ruled in her own right and who fought to maintain her power, even when her son challenged her. This was the heritage that flowed through Baldwin's veins, a mixture of French nobility and the unique royal line of Jerusalem, tempered in the crucible of constant warfare and cultural complexity. The court in which Baldwin would grow up was a place of both ceremony and practicality. The kings of Jerusalem maintained many of the trappings of European royalty, with elaborate coronation ceremonies, formal courts, and all the rituals that marked their status as anointed monarchs. Yet they also had to be warriors first and foremost, men who could don armor and lead armies into battle at a moment's notice. The luxury of purely ceremonial kingship was a privilege these monarchs could not afford. In the year of Baldwin's birth, the kingdom faced particular challenges. To the north, the powerful Muslim ruler Nur ad-Din controlled much of Syria, and he harbored ambitions to unite all the Muslim lands under his banner and drive the Crusaders into the sea. To the south, Egypt remained under the control of the Fatimid Caliphate, though that ancient dynasty was in decline, creating a power vacuum that both the Crusaders and Nur ad-Din hoped to fill. The question of who would control Egypt, with its enormous wealth and strategic position, would dominate the politics of Baldwin's youth. Baldwin's mother, Agnes of Courtenay, was a figure who would cast a long shadow over his life, though in ways that would only become apparent as he grew older. She came from the powerful Courtenay family, descended from Jocelyn II, the last Count of Edessa, before that Crusader state fell to Muslim forces in 1144. Her marriage to Amalric had produced 2 children, Baldwin and his older sister Sibylla, but the union had been controversial from the start. When Amalric ascended to the throne in 1163, the nobles of the kingdom presented him with an ultimatum that must have cut deeply. They opposed Agnes as queen, citing concerns about consanguinity. She and Amalric were too closely related according to the church's complex rules about marriage. But beneath this religious objection lay political calculations. The barons feared Agnes's influence and the power her relatives might gain if she became queen. They demanded that Amalric annul the marriage as a condition of accepting him as king. Amalric, pragmatic and ambitious, agreed to set Agnes aside. However, he insisted, and the church agreed, that the annulment would not affect the legitimacy of their children. Young Baldwin and Sibylla were declared legitimate heirs to the throne, their rights to succession preserved even as their mother was pushed away from the centre of power. Agnes was given estates and income befitting her status as the mother of royal children, but she was not welcome at court. For Baldwin, this meant growing up largely separated from his mother during his early years, though she would return to play a significant role in his life once he became king. In 1167, Amalric remarried, this time to Maria Comnena, a Byzantine princess and the great niece of the Emperor Manuel III Comnenus. This marriage was a diplomatic triumph, cementing an alliance with the mighty Byzantine Empire and bringing with it the hope of military and financial support from Constantinople. Maria was everything that Agnes had not been allowed to be: a proper queen, welcomed at court, her marriage celebrated rather than merely tolerated. From this union would come another daughter, Isabella, who would be Baldwin's half-sister. For young Baldwin, these political machinations of the adult world likely seemed distant and incomprehensible. He was a child living in a palace, surrounded by servants and tutors, growing up with all the privileges that came with being a prince. He would have been taught to ride almost as soon as he could walk, for horsemanship was the foundation of all noble training. The games of childhood in the Crusader kingdoms were preparation for warfare, mock battles with wooden swords, learning to handle a lance, understanding the basics of military tactics through play. The city of Jerusalem would have been his playground and his classroom. He would have walked through streets where Jesus himself had walked, a fact that would have been impressed upon him from his earliest days. He would have attended services in churches whose stones were ancient before the Crusaders arrived, heard pilgrims from distant lands speaking in strange tongues, watched the constant flow of merchants and soldiers and priests that gave the city its unique character. Baldwin would have been taught letters and languages, for a king needed to be educated as well as brave. Latin was essential, the language of the church and of learning. French was the language of the court and the nobility. But a prince of Jerusalem would also benefit from knowing Greek, which would help in dealings with the Byzantine Empire, and perhaps even some Arabic, the language of the realm's Muslim neighbors and subjects. The ability to understand what your enemies were saying could mean the difference between victory and defeat, between life and death. The lessons of kingship would have been all around him. He would have witnessed his father holding court, dispensing justice, meeting with nobles and petitioners. He would have learned that a king must be accessible to his subjects, must listen to their grievances, must balance mercy with justice. He would have seen his father preparing for military campaigns, calling up the feudal levies, inspecting fortifications, meeting with his military commanders to plan strategy. His father, King Amalric, was an energetic and ambitious ruler, constantly seeking ways to expand the kingdom and secure its future. Amalric understood that the kingdom's survival likely depended on controlling Egypt, and he launched multiple campaigns southward, sometimes in alliance with the Byzantines, sometimes on his own. These campaigns often took Amalric away from Jerusalem for months at a time, leaving young Baldwin in the care of tutors and guardians. The early years of Baldwin's life unfolded against a backdrop of constant military activity and political maneuvering. The Crusader states were always preparing for the next campaign, the next siege, the next battle. The church bells that rang out the hours also rang out warnings when enemies approached. The markets sold not just spices and cloth, but also weapons and armor. every able-bodied man knew how to fight, and even the clergy were not strangers to warfare, with militant religious orders like the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller serving as elite military forces. Yet amidst all this preparation for war, there was also culture and learning. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was home to some of the most educated men in Christendom, and the court attracted scholars and chroniclers who understood the historical significance of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. One such man would soon enter Baldwin's life and change it forever, though neither the man nor the boy could have anticipated just how profound that change would be. As Baldwin approached his 9th year, appearing healthy and vigorous, energetic and intelligent, there was every reason to believe that he would grow up to be the strong warrior king his father hoped for. The succession seemed secure. The kingdom, while always under pressure, had survived for more than 6 decades and seemed likely to survive for decades more. The future, while always uncertain in the dangerous world of the Crusader states, looked relatively bright for this young prince who bore a famous name and carried the hopes of a Christian kingdom established in the heart of the Islamic world. But fate, which had already taken the life of the uncle he never knew, had more trials in store for young Baldwin. A discovery was approaching that would transform his life, define his reign, and make his name resonate through the centuries as one of the most remarkable and tragic figures of the medieval age. The boy, who seemed destined for a conventional life of medieval nobility, was about to begin a journey that would test the limits of human courage, determination, and the power of the human spirit to transcend the limitations of the body. In the year 1170, when Baldwin had reached his 9th year, his father King Amalric made a decision that would have profound consequences for the future of the kingdom. He appointed a tutor for his son, entrusting the education of the heir to the throne to one of the most learned men in all of the Crusader states. This man was William, who at that time served as Archdeacon of Tyre, and who would later become Archbishop of Tyre and one of the most important chroniclers of the Crusader period. William of Tyre was an extraordinary individual, a man whose education and accomplishments would have been remarkable in any age. Born in Jerusalem around 1130 to a family of Western European settlers, William had been sent to Europe as a young man to pursue his studies. For more than 20 years, he studied in the great schools of France and Italy, mastering Latin, Greek, and Arabic, immersing himself in theology, law, and the classical authors. He knew Virgil and Cicero, studied canon law at Bologna, and absorbed the intellectual currents that flowed through the universities of Western Europe. When William returned to the East in 1165, he brought with him a breadth of learning unmatched by almost anyone in the Crusader kingdoms. King Amalric, who valued learning and understood its importance, quickly recognized William's worth. The king commissioned William to write a history of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a task that William would pursue for the rest of his life, producing a chronicle that remains one of our most important sources for understanding the Crusader states. This work, written in Latin with the engaging title, A History of Deeds Done Beyond the Sea, would preserve for posterity the events that William witnessed with his own eyes, including the tragic story of his royal pupil. William took his duties as tutor seriously, understanding that he was shaping the mind of a future king. He designed a curriculum that would give Baldwin the education befitting a Christian monarch, knowledge of scripture and theology, certainly, but also history, both ancient and recent, and the practical skills of reading, writing, and logical thinking. A king needed to be able to read treaties and understand them, to write letters to other monarchs and to the Pope, to think clearly in moments of crisis. The lessons took place in the palace, perhaps in a quiet chamber where teacher and pupil could work without constant interruption. William would have found his young student bright and eager to learn, possessed of a sharp mind and a good memory. Baldwin showed the kind of quick intelligence that makes teaching a pleasure, grasping concepts readily and demonstrating genuine curiosity about the world beyond the walls of Jerusalem. During breaks from formal lessons, Baldwin would play with other children of noble birth, for even the heir to the throne needed companionship and the rough and tumble play that prepares boys for the physical demands of knighthood. It was during one of these play sessions that William made a discovery that would change everything. The incident was recounted by William himself in his chronicle, and his words carry the weight of personal witness and deep sorrow. The boys were engaged in a common game of their age and station, one that seemed strange to modern sensibilities, but was typical of medieval childhood training. They were testing each other's endurance and toughness by scratching and pinching each other's arms, competing to see who could withstand pain without crying out. Such games were seen as character building, preparing boys for the injuries they would inevitably sustain in battle and teaching them to master their fear and pain. William, who had been observing the boys at play, noticed something alarming. While the other children showed evidence of pain through their outcries and reactions, young Baldwin endured the scratching and pinching with unusual patience. In fact, he showed no reaction at all, as though he felt nothing whatsoever. The other boys continued their rough treatment, perhaps thinking Baldwin was simply being brave. But William's scholarly mind recognized that something was deeply wrong. After the other children had departed, William called Baldwin aside and examined his arms carefully. What he saw disturbed him greatly. Baldwin's right arm and hand showed a significant loss of sensation. When William pinched the skin, Baldwin reported no discomfort. When William pressed harder, even using his nails, the boy still felt nothing. The flesh appeared normal to the eye, without obvious lesions or discoloration, but the complete absence of sensation was deeply troubling. William of Tyre was an educated man, well read in medical texts, and he understood immediately what this symptom might indicate. The loss of sensation, particularly in the extremities, was a classic early sign of one of the most feared diseases known to medieval humanity, leprosy, known then as lepra, or the disease of St. Lazarus. But William was also cautious, understanding the gravity of such a diagnosis and the catastrophic implications it would have for the young prince and for the kingdom. Leprosy carried a terrible stigma in medieval society, viewed as both a physical disease and a spiritual affliction. The disease was mentioned in the Bible, in passages from the Old Testament that described it as a mark of divine displeasure. The book of Leviticus laid out elaborate rules for diagnosing leprosy and dealing with those who suffered from it, requiring that they be separated from the community, declared ritually unclean, and forced to call out unclean, unclean, if anyone approached them. Medieval Christians interpreted these ancient Jewish purity laws through their own theological lens. While the Church taught that disease was not necessarily a punishment for personal sin, many people still believed that lepers must have done something to deserve their fate. There was enormous social stigma attached to the disease, and those diagnosed with it often faced complete exclusion from normal society. In many parts of Europe, a person diagnosed with leprosy would undergo a ceremony almost like a funeral, after which they would be legally dead to the world, forced to live in isolated leper colonies or beg at the roadside. The medical understanding of leprosy in the 12th century was limited and often inaccurate. Doctors knew the disease was somehow contagious, though they did not understand the mechanism of transmission. They observed that it seemed to run in families and that close contact with sufferers increased the risk of infection. But they had no concept of bacteria or the slow-growing mycobacterium that actually causes the disease. Treatment was essentially non-existent. Various ointments and potions were tried, but none had any real effect on the progression of the illness. What medieval doctors could observe was the terrible course of the disease in its victims. Leprosy is caused by Mycobacterium leprae, a bacterium that primarily affects the skin, nerves, and mucous membranes. The bacteria grow extremely slowly, which means the disease progresses gradually, sometimes over many years or even decades. In its lepromatous form, the type that would afflict Baldwin, the bacteria attack the peripheral nerves, causing a loss of sensation in the extremities. This leads to a terrible cycle of injury and infection, as victims cannot feel when they hurt themselves and wounds go untreated until they become seriously infected. The disease causes characteristic lesions on the skin, nodules and patches that disfigure the face and body. As it progresses, it can lead to the erosion of bones, particularly in the face, hands, and feet. Victims often lost fingers and toes, not directly from the disease itself, but from repeated injuries that went unfelt and untreated. Blindness was common in advanced cases, as the bacteria attacked the delicate nerves of the eyes. Throughout this physical degradation, the mind typically remained clear, forcing the sufferer to remain fully aware of their deterioration. William understood enough about leprosy to know that a single symptom, observed once, was not sufficient for a diagnosis. He consulted with physicians, including the most learned doctors available in Jerusalem. Among these was Abu Sulaiman Dawood, a highly respected Arab Christian physician who had studied medicine in Egypt and who served the royal court. These learned men examined Baldwin and acknowledged that the loss of sensation was concerning, but they counseled patience. Not every case of reduced feeling was leprosy. Nerves could be damaged by injury or other illnesses. The physicians advised watching the boy carefully for other symptoms before making a definitive diagnosis. This cautious approach reflected both medical prudence and political necessity. To declare the heir to the throne a leper based on preliminary symptoms would create immediate chaos. The succession would be thrown into doubt. The morale of the kingdom would be shattered. Foreign powers would see the Crusader states as weakened and vulnerable. King Amalric himself would face terrible choices about his son's future. Everyone involved had strong incentives to hope that the symptoms would prove to be something other than leprosy, or that they might somehow resolve on their own. For Baldwin himself, these examinations and consultations must have been frightening and confusing. He was only 9 years old, not old enough to fully grasp the implications of what the adults feared, but certainly old enough to sense their concern. He knew something was wrong with him, that his inability to feel pain in his arm was abnormal and worrying. The attention of physicians and the worried conversations that were suddenly happening around him would have made clear that this was serious, even if no one explicitly told him what they suspected. Despite the ominous signs, Baldwin's education continued. William of Tyre remained his tutor, and the lessons went on much as they had before. If anything, William may have worked even harder to prepare Baldwin's mind for the challenges ahead, knowing that intellectual sharpness might need to compensate for physical limitations. The young prince continued to show himself an able student, mastering Latin and improving his knowledge of history and theology. Baldwin also continued his physical training, for nothing had been confirmed yet, and there was always hope that the symptoms might not progress. He learned to ride horses, an essential skill for any nobleman, and absolutely critical for a future king. Contemporary accounts indicate that Baldwin showed considerable talent as a horseman, able to control his mount with skill, even as his disease progressed. This ability to ride despite his affliction would later prove crucial to his ability to lead armies. The months following the discovery of Baldwin's symptoms must have been agonizing for his father. King Amalric was a vigorous man in his early 30s, healthy and active, and he had every reason to expect many more years of life. But he was also a realist who understood the precarious nature of life in the Crusader kingdoms, where disease, injury, and violence could strike without warning. He knew that if something happened to him, Baldwin would become king, regardless of his medical condition. The question was whether it would be possible to keep the boy's condition secret, or at least ambiguous, long enough for him to secure the succession. Amalric's own health would soon become a concern, though no one could have predicted how quickly tragedy would strike. In June of 1174, while staying in the city of Tyre, the king fell suddenly and violently ill. He developed severe dysentery, a common and often deadly affliction in the medieval Mediterranean. Despite the efforts of his physicians, his condition deteriorated rapidly. Within days, it became clear that the king was dying. On July 11, 1174, King Amalric III died at Tyre, only 38 years old. His reign cut short after just 11 years on the throne. His death sent shockwaves through the kingdom. He had been planning new campaigns, working on diplomatic alliances, actively ruling and leading. His sudden passing left the kingdom in the hands of his 13-year-old son, a boy who was bright and well-educated, but woefully inexperienced, and who carried within his body a disease that would eventually kill him, and that might, if it became widely known, destroy the legitimacy of his reign before it even began. The death of his father marked the end of Baldwin's childhood and the beginning of one of the most remarkable reigns in medieval history. The boy, who had been discovered to have suspicious symptoms only 4 years earlier, was about to become king of one of the most important and endangered Christian realms on earth. The question of his disease still hung in the air, not yet definitively diagnosed, but increasingly difficult to deny. Yet there was no alternative candidate immediately available who could be made king instead, and the succession laws of Jerusalem were clear. Baldwin was the legitimate heir. In the crisis following Amalric's death, the barons and bishops of the kingdom made a momentous decision. They would crown Baldwin as king, despite their suspicions about his health, because to do otherwise would create even greater chaos. Perhaps they hoped the symptoms would not progress, or that a cure might be found, or that Baldwin would live long enough to secure an heir through his sister Sibylla. Perhaps they simply had no better option and chose to deal with one crisis at a time rather than borrow trouble from an uncertain future. And so, just 4 days after his father's death, on July 15, 1174, Baldwin IV was crowned King of Jerusalem in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The date was symbolically significant. It was the 75th anniversary of the First Crusade's capture of Jerusalem, a reminder of the glorious origins of the Crusader kingdom. The ceremony would have been magnificent, with all the nobility of the realm present, the patriarch placing the crown on Baldwin's young head, the ancient prayers invoking God's blessing on the new king. The boy who knelt to be crowned that day knew already that something was wrong with his body, though the full extent of his affliction remained unclear. The adults who witnessed his coronation harbored fears they dared not speak aloud, and somewhere to the south and east, in the courts of Cairo and Damascus, Muslim rulers who had long sought to drive the Crusaders from the Holy Land began to calculate how they might take advantage of a child king who was rumored to be diseased. The stage was set for one of history's most compelling dramas, the reign of the Leper King. The kingdom of Jerusalem that Baldwin IV inherited upon his father's death was a realm of remarkable complexity and constant peril, stretching from the Mediterranean coast inland to the desert borders, from the kingdom of Armenia in the north to the Sinai Peninsula in the south. It represented the most successful and enduring of the Crusader states established in the wake of the First Crusade. Yet for all its achievements, the kingdom remained fundamentally vulnerable. An island of Latin Christianity surrounded by Muslim powers that vastly outnumbered its fighting men and possessed far greater resources. The population of the kingdom was perhaps 120,000 people at most, of whom only a fraction were the Frankish Catholic nobles and knights who formed the military and political elite. The majority of the population consisted of indigenous Christians, Greek Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, Armenians and others, along with significant Jewish and Muslim minorities. This religious and cultural diversity was one of the kingdom's great strengths, for it could draw on the knowledge, skills and commerce of all these communities, but it was also a source of tension, as the Latin Catholic minority maintained a monopoly on political power and the highest church offices. The military strength of the kingdom rested on a relatively small corps of heavily armoured knights, supplemented by infantry levies, mercenaries, and the formidable military religious orders. The Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller maintained their own fortresses and could field several hundred fully equipped knights apiece, making them crucial to the kingdom's defence. But even with all these forces combined, the kingdom could rarely field more than a few thousand mounted knights, a force that could be matched or exceeded by any of the major Muslim powers. The wealth of the kingdom came from multiple sources. Agricultural production in the coastal plains and the fertile valleys of Galilee provided food and some export crops, but the real wealth flowed from trade. The ports of Acre, Tyre and Jaffa were conduits for goods moving between Europe and the East, with Italian merchant republics, particularly Venice, Genoa and Pisa, maintaining major commercial operations. The kingdom taxed this trade, and the monarchy also received revenues from the royal domain, customs duties and payments from vassals. Yet even with all these sources of income, the kingdom never had enough money to maintain the fortifications, pay the mercenaries, and conduct the campaigns necessary to secure its survival. Culturally, the kingdom represented a fascinating fusion of East and West. The Frankish nobility lived in palaces and castles that borrowed architectural elements from both European and Islamic traditions. They wore clothing adapted to the hot climate, ate foods incorporating Eastern spices and cooking techniques, and employed physicians trained in the Arabic medical tradition. Yet they remained fundamentally Western in their identity, speaking French at court, following European customs of chivalry and feudalism, and maintaining close ties with their relatives in France, Germany, and Italy. Into this complex realm, Baldwin IV arrived as king at the tender age of 13, officially crowned, but not yet able to rule in his own right. Medieval custom held that a king reached his majority at 15, the age at which he could assume full royal authority. Until then, a regent was necessary, someone to govern in the king's name, make decisions, command armies, and handle the day-to-day business of running a kingdom. The choice of regent was therefore crucial, for the wrong choice could lead to tyranny, corruption, or simply incompetent governance that might doom the kingdom. Shortly after Baldwin's coronation, the choice fell upon Miles of Plancy, a powerful nobleman who had served King Amalric as a close advisor and who had married a daughter of the royal family. Miles was competent and ambitious, qualities that could serve the kingdom well, but also made him unpopular among other nobles who resented his influence. His regency would be short-lived in the most dramatic fashion possible. In October of 1174, just months after taking office, Miles of Plancy was assassinated in the streets of Acre, cut down by killers whose identities and motives remain murky, though political rivalry among the nobility was the most likely explanation. With Miles dead, the barons and bishops of the kingdom turned to Raymond III, Count of Tripoli, to serve as regent. This choice was significant in multiple ways. Raymond was one of the most powerful nobles in the Crusader states, ruling the county of Tripoli, which, while technically separate from the Kingdom of Jerusalem, was closely tied to it through family connections and strategic necessity. He was also Baldwin's kinsman, being the first cousin once removed of the young king. Perhaps most importantly, Raymond had a reputation for intelligence, diplomatic skill, and military competence, all qualities desperately needed in a regent. Count Raymond of Tripoli was a man shaped by extraordinary experiences. In 1164, while still a young man, he had been captured in battle by Nur ad-Din's forces and spent 8 years as a prisoner in Aleppo. This captivity had given him an intimate knowledge of Muslim society and politics that few other Frankish nobles possessed. He had learned Arabic, studied his captor's culture and military methods, and developed a more nuanced understanding of the Muslim world than most crusaders ever achieved. When he was finally ransomed and released in 1172, he returned to his lands older, wiser, and possessing insights that would prove valuable in the complex diplomatic and military situation facing the Crusader states. Raymond's appointment as regent was welcomed by the moderate faction among the nobility, those who understood that the Crusader states survived through a combination of military strength and careful diplomacy, knowing when to fight and when to negotiate. But from the beginning, Raymond's regency was constrained by the reality of Baldwin's disease, which was becoming increasingly impossible to deny or hide. During the first year of Baldwin's reign, the symptoms that William of Tyre had first observed continued to develop and spread. By the time Raymond assumed the regency, it was confirmed beyond doubt that the young king suffered from leprosy. The loss of sensation that had begun in his right arm and hand was spreading to his left side as well. Close observers could see the early signs of skin lesions, the characteristic marks of the disease that would become more pronounced over time. The confirmation of Baldwin's leprosy sent ripples of concern through the kingdom and beyond. In the courts of Europe, when news arrived that the King of Jerusalem was a leper, there were gasps of shock and expressions of sympathy mixed with a grim recognition of what this might mean for the Crusader cause. Among the Muslim powers surrounding the kingdom, the news was received with a mixture of satisfaction and puzzlement. Satisfaction that their enemies faced such a blow. Puzzlement that the Franks had crowned a leper king at all. Something that seemed incomprehensible given the way lepers were treated in most societies. Yet Baldwin was not forced to abdicate or sent away to a leper colony. Several factors contributed to this remarkable situation. First, the laws and customs of the Kingdom of Jerusalem made no provision for removing an anointed king solely because of disease. Baldwin had been properly crowned by the patriarch in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, anointed with holy oil in a ceremony that conferred sacred status. To depose an anointed king was not a matter to be taken lightly, especially without a clear alternative candidate. Second, the very survival of the kingdom demanded continuity and stability. To declare the throne vacant and start a succession crisis while surrounded by enemies would have been suicidal. Better to keep the legitimate king, even if he was diseased, and hope that his sister Sibylla could be married to a strong heir who would eventually take the throne. Any instability or sign of weakness would be an invitation to Saladin and other Muslim leaders to attack. Third, and perhaps most remarkably, Baldwin himself was proving to be far more capable than anyone had expected. Despite his youth and his disease, he was showing real aptitude for kingship. He was intelligent, well educated thanks to William of Tyre's tutoring, and possessed of a courage that would become legendary. He did not wallow in self-pity or let his disease define him. Instead, he approached his royal duties with determination and a clear sense of responsibility. The young king also benefited from something unusual, a degree of acceptance from his subjects that defied the typical medieval response to leprosy. Perhaps it was because he was king, anointed by God, and therefore his disease could not diminish his sacred status. Perhaps it was because the Christians of Jerusalem, living in close proximity to diverse populations and facing constant external threats, had developed a more pragmatic attitude toward illness. The city was home to the Order of St. Lazarus, a religious military order specifically founded to care for leper knights, demonstrating that even lepers could serve in the defense of the kingdom. Muslim observers of the time were puzzled and somewhat scandalized by the Franks' acceptance of a leper king. Ibn Jubayr, an Andalusian traveller who visited the kingdom in 1184, wrote with evident disapproval about how Baldwin continued to rule despite his disease, how his subjects remained loyal to him, and how they seemed to pay no attention to his leprosy. To Muslim sensibilities, shaped by different cultural and religious attitudes toward ritual purity and disease, this seemed almost blasphemous. Yet this acceptance would prove to be one of the kingdom's strengths, allowing Baldwin to function as an effective monarch far longer than anyone might have predicted. During Raymond's regency, from 1174 to 1176, the kingdom focused on defense and consolidation, rather than aggressive expansion. This was partly necessity. A child king with leprosy was not in a position to lead ambitious military campaigns, and partly Raymond's natural caution and diplomatic skill. The regent negotiated truces when possible, strengthened fortifications, and tried to keep the kingdom's fractious nobility working together rather than fighting among themselves. Raymond also had to manage the complex politics surrounding Baldwin's mother, Agnes of Courtenay, who now sought to return to court and exercise influence over her son. Agnes had been excluded during Amalric's reign, but with her former husband dead and her son now king, she saw an opportunity to reclaim her position. Raymond and Agnes would eventually become political rivals, representing different factions and different approaches to governance. But for now, during Baldwin's minority, Raymond held the upper hand as regent. The young king was not merely a passive figurehead during this period. Baldwin attended council meetings, observed how Raymond handled affairs of state, and continued his education in the arts of war and governance. He learned by watching, absorbing lessons about diplomacy, military strategy, and the delicate art of managing powerful nobles who nominally owed him obedience, but who possessed independent military forces and sometimes independent agendas. Baldwin also continued to develop his skills as a horseman, a determination that speaks volumes about his character. Despite the progressive loss of sensation in his hands and arms, despite the physical weakness that would increasingly plague him, Baldwin worked tirelessly to master the difficult art of mounted combat. Medieval warfare, especially among the Frankish knights, centered on the heavy cavalry charge, where knights in full armor thundered forward with lances couched, smashing into enemy formations with devastating impact. To participate in such warfare required extraordinary skill, strength, and courage under the best circumstances. For a young man gradually losing the ability to feel his extremities, learning to control a warhorse and wield weapons was an achievement bordering on the miraculous. Contemporary accounts describe how Baldwin adapted to his limitations, learning techniques that would allow him to fight despite his disease. He would have his hands bound to his reins and his weapons so that he couldn't drop them when his grip failed. He learned to guide his horse with his legs and body position, compensating for reduced sensation in his hands. He trained constantly, building muscle memory that would allow him to fight even when he couldn't fully feel what he was doing. This dedication to mastering the military arts would prove crucial when he later had to lead armies in person to maintain his authority and credibility. The 2 years of Raymond's regency were relatively peaceful, at least by the standards of the Crusader states. There were minor skirmishes and raids, but no major campaigns or battles. This breathing space allowed Baldwin to mature, to learn, and to prepare for the responsibilities he would soon assume. It also allowed the kingdom to rebuild its resources after the drain of Amalric's ambitious campaigns against Egypt. But this peace could not last. To the east and south, a new power was rising, one that would dominate the history of Baldwin's reign and ultimately bring about the destruction of the kingdom of Jerusalem. His name was Saladin, and he was in the process of uniting the Muslim world under his banner with the explicit goal of driving the Crusaders from the Holy Land. The conflict between Baldwin the Leper King and Saladin the Great would become one of the defining struggles of the crusading era. As Baldwin approached his 15th birthday in 1176, the date when he would reach his majority and assume direct rule, the kingdom held its collective breath. Would this young man, disease-ridden but determined, be able to govern effectively? Could he command the respect of his nobles and the fear of his enemies? Would his illness progress so rapidly that he would be unable to function as king? These questions hung heavy in the air as the day approached, when Baldwin IV would step out from behind his regent and rule Jerusalem in his own right. The answers to these questions would surprise everyone, allies and enemies alike. The young man, who had been diagnosed with one of history's most feared diseases, would prove to be one of the most capable and courageous rulers his kingdom had ever known. His name would be remembered with honor and admiration by both Christians and Muslims, and his greatest triumph was still ahead, waiting in the sands near a place called Montgisard. In the spring of 1176, Baldwin IV celebrated his 15th birthday, the age at which medieval custom held that a king reached his majority and could assume full royal authority. The regency of Raymond III of Tripoli officially ended, though Raymond's influence would continue to be felt in the politics of the kingdom for years to come. For Baldwin, this transition from boy king to ruling monarch in his own right marked the true beginning of his personal reign, when he would make decisions in his own name and bear full responsibility for the fate of his kingdom. The transition of power was conducted with all due ceremony, but it could not mask the extraordinary circumstances of Baldwin's situation. He was a young man, barely into his teens by modern reckoning, already visibly afflicted by a disease that was progressing despite all hopes to the contrary. By 1176, the signs of leprosy were unmistakable to anyone who saw the king. His hands showed the characteristic loss of sensation and early disfigurement. His face was beginning to develop the lesions and nodules that marked advanced cases of the disease. His physical strength, never robust due to his illness, was clearly limited compared to other young men his age. Yet Baldwin was determined to rule as a true king, not merely to reign in name while others made decisions for him. One of his first acts upon assuming power was to bring his uncle, Jocelyn III of Courtenay, into a position of significant authority. Jocelyn was the brother of Baldwin's mother Agnes, and his appointment signalled that Agnes herself was returning to influence at court. This decision alienated Raymond of Tripoli and some of the other powerful barons who had hoped to maintain their influence over the young king, setting the stage for the factional struggles that would plague Baldwin's reign. The return of Agnes of Courtenay to prominence at court was controversial. Many of the established nobles, particularly those from the older Crusader families, viewed Agnes and her relatives with suspicion and resentment. They saw her as an outsider, someone who had been set aside by King Amalric for good reasons, and they feared that she would use her influence over her son to advance the interests of her family and faction at the expense of the kingdom's welfare. These fears would prove at least partially justified, as the Courtenay family did indeed benefit greatly from Baldwin's reign, receiving lands, titles, and appointments. But Baldwin's decision to embrace his mother and her family also reflected a political reality. He needed allies he could trust absolutely, people whose fortunes were bound to his own survival and success. In the dangerous world of crusader politics, where powerful barons maintained their own armies and sometimes pursued independent foreign policies, a king without a strong base of support was vulnerable to manipulation or even deposition. By elevating his maternal relatives, Baldwin created a party at court that was fiercely loyal to him personally, counterbalancing the influence of the great barons like Raymond of Tripoli. One of the most pressing concerns facing the young king was his own succession. Leprosy meant that Baldwin could not marry and father children. The disease made marriage politically impossible, and the progressive physical deterioration made procreation unlikely even if marriage had been permitted. This meant that the succession would pass through his sister Sibylla, who was a few years older than Baldwin. Ensuring that Sibylla married someone suitable, someone who could serve as heir and eventually king, became one of the central preoccupations of Baldwin's reign. The first attempt to secure a good match for Sibylla occurred in 1176, when Baldwin arranged her marriage to William of Montferrat, called William Longsword. This was a brilliant match from a diplomatic perspective. William was a member of one of the most powerful noble families in northern Italy, and he was related to both the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa and King Louis VII of France. Such connections could potentially bring significant military and financial support to Jerusalem from the great powers of Western Europe. William arrived in Jerusalem in 1176, and the marriage was celebrated with great ceremony. There must have been considerable hope that this young, capable nobleman would prove to be the heir the kingdom needed, that he would support Baldwin during the remainder of his reign, and eventually take the throne after him. The future seemed, for a moment, to offer some stability and hope despite Baldwin's illness. But fate, which had already been so cruel to Baldwin personally, had more tragedy in store for the royal family. In June of 1177, less than a year after his arrival in Jerusalem, William of Montferrat fell suddenly ill while in Ascalon. The exact nature of his illness is not recorded, but it struck quickly and violently. Baldwin himself was also in Ascalon at the time, having travelled to the coastal fortress for some purpose of state, and he too became gravely ill with what appears to have been the same ailment, likely malaria, which was endemic in the coastal regions, or some other fever. For days, both the king and his brother-in-law lay sick, their lives hanging in the balance. The kingdom held its breath, facing the potential loss of both its king and the heir designate in one terrible blow. Baldwin, young and already weakened by leprosy, fought for his life. William of Montferrat's condition deteriorated more rapidly. Despite the best efforts of physicians, William died in June of 1177, leaving Sibylla a widow after less than a year of marriage. She was, however, pregnant with his child, offering at least the possibility of a male heir if the baby proved to be a boy. Baldwin survived his illness, though it left him even weaker than before and may have accelerated the progression of his leprosy. The king's survival, while obviously necessary for the kingdom, also meant that the succession crisis had not been resolved. Sibylla was once again unmarried, and the kingdom was once again vulnerable to the ambitions of any powerful nobleman who might seek to marry her and thereby position himself as the next king. The death of William of Montferrat and Baldwin's own near-death experience came at a particularly dangerous moment. The king was incapacitated, lying sick in Ascalon without the ability to lead armies or even to govern effectively. The kingdom had been left without strong leadership, just as military affairs demanded attention, for Saladin was growing increasingly powerful in Egypt and Syria, and the threat of a major Muslim offensive was mounting. In this moment of crisis, Baldwin made a decision that would prove crucial to the greatest military victory of his reign. He appointed Raynald of Chatillon, the controversial Lord of Queyrac, to serve as regent with command over the military forces. This choice was bold and somewhat surprising, for Raynald was a divisive figure whose actions had often caused problems for the kingdom. But Baldwin clearly saw in Raynald what he needed at that moment: a capable military commander who would act decisively and who had the force of personality to command respect from the various military forces of the kingdom. Raynald of Chatillon was one of the most colourful and controversial figures in the history of the Crusader states. He had arrived in the East with the Second Crusade in 1147 and stayed behind when the crusade ended, seeking his fortune in the Levant. He had married Constance of Antioch, becoming Prince of Antioch through this marriage, though his rule there had been marked by brutal actions, including the torture of a patriarch and a devastating raid on Byzantine Cyprus that had drawn the wrath of the Byzantine emperor. In 1160, Raynald had been captured by Muslim forces while raiding along the Euphrates River, and he spent the next 16 years as a prisoner in Aleppo. This long captivity had given him a deep hatred of his Muslim enemies, but also a thorough knowledge of their ways. When he was finally ransomed in 1176, he returned to find the Crusader world much changed. His first wife had died during his captivity, but he quickly remarried, wedding Stephanie of Milly, the Lady of Ultra-Jourdain. This marriage made Raynald Lord of Queyrac and Montreal, two crucial fortresses that controlled the caravan routes between Egypt and Syria. Baldwin's decision to entrust military command to Raynald during this crisis suggests that the young king possessed considerable insight into character and capabilities. Raynald was aggressive, sometimes reckless, and certainly capable of actions that violated truces and diplomatic norms. But he was also brave, experienced, and willing to take the initiative, qualities that would prove essential in the coming months. While Baldwin slowly recovered from his illness in Ascalon, another powerful figure arrived in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, one whose presence would significantly complicate the political and military situation. Philip of Alsace, Count of Flanders, reached the Holy Land in August of 1177, at the head of a significant Crusader army. Philip was one of the wealthiest and most powerful nobles in the Western Europe, and his arrival with fresh troops seemed like a godsend to the hard-pressed kingdom. However, Philip's presence would prove to be a mixed blessing at best. The Count of Flanders had come on crusade with his own agenda and his own ideas about how the Crusader states should be governed and defended. Baldwin, still recovering and working from a position of weakness due to his illness, offered Philip the regency of the kingdom, hoping to use his military strength to defend Jerusalem. But Philip refused this offer, claiming that he had not come to govern, but simply to fulfill his crusading vow by fighting against the Muslims. This refusal masked Philip's true intentions, which were more complex and self-serving. He wanted to participate in military campaigns and gain glory and perhaps territory, but he did not want the responsibility and constraints that came with serving as regent for a leper king. He also seems to have had ambitions regarding Sibylla, the king's sister and heir, possibly hoping to arrange a marriage between her and one of his own vassals, which would give him indirect control over the succession to Jerusalem. The political maneuvering surrounding Philip of Flanders' visit consumed attention and energy that should have been focused on military preparedness. There were grand plans for joint Byzantine Crusader campaigns against Egypt, building on the alliance that had been established when King Amalric married the Byzantine princess Maria Komnena. But these plans required coordination and unity of purpose, qualities that were sorely lacking among the various parties involved. Philip of Flanders, Count Raymond of Tripoli, Prince Bohemond of Antioch, and the Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller all had their own priorities, and none were willing to subordinate their interest to a coordinated strategy under Baldwin's leadership. The Byzantine fleet that had been promised for the Egyptian campaign eventually withdrew, frustrated by the disunity and lack of preparation on the Crusader side. The ambitious plans for offensive operations dissolved into petty squabbling and competing interests, instead of joining a united effort to support King Baldwin and defend Jerusalem. Philip of Flanders took his forces north to assist Raymond of Tripoli in a campaign against the Muslim-held city of Hama in Syria. This division of forces would have catastrophic consequences, for it left the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself dangerously exposed, with most of its military strength deployed far to the north just as the greatest threat was approaching from the south. Saladin, who had been carefully watching the Crusader kingdoms for signs of weakness, saw his opportunity. The Frankish forces were divided, their leadership was in disarray, and their young king was sick and weakened. The great nobles of the Crusader states were pursuing their own campaigns in the north, leaving Jerusalem protected by only a minimal garrison. It was the perfect moment to strike, to perhaps destroy the Crusader kingdom in one devastating campaign. In November of 1177, Saladin assembled a large army in Egypt and began marching toward Palestine. His plan was to sweep through the Kingdom of Jerusalem, taking advantage of the absent Crusader armies to seize key fortresses and possibly even Jerusalem itself. The Muslim sultan had defeated the Crusaders before, and he had every reason to believe he could do so again, especially against a king who was barely more than a boy and who was visibly dying of leprosy. But Saladin had made a fundamental miscalculation. He had underestimated the young Leper King, who despite his illness, despite his youth, despite the betrayals and disappointments he had already endured, possessed extraordinary courage and determination. Baldwin IV was about to demonstrate that he was not merely a sick teenager clinging to a throne he was too weak to defend. He was a warrior king who would fight for his kingdom with every resource at his disposal, using his mind when his body failed him, and leading from the front even when doing so meant facing pain and death. The stage was set for the Battle of Montgisard, the defining moment of Baldwin IV's reign and one of the most dramatic confrontations of the entire Crusader period. A massive Muslim army led by the most capable general in the Islamic world was marching toward an apparently defenseless Jerusalem. All that stood between Saladin and triumph was a sick teenager with a tiny army, badly outnumbered and lacking the support of most of the kingdom's military strength. What happened next would become legend. To understand the challenges that Baldwin IV faced throughout his reign, it is essential to understand the man who would become his greatest adversary, the Muslim leader who posed the most serious threat to the Kingdom of Jerusalem since its founding. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to history as Saladin, and his rise to power coincided almost exactly with Baldwin's own ascension to the throne of Jerusalem. The parallel trajectories of these two men, one a Christian king afflicted with leprosy, the other a Muslim sultan driven by religious fervor and political ambition, would define the last decades of the 12th century in the Holy Land. Saladin was born around 1137 or 1138 in the town of Tikrit in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, into a Kurdish family that had entered military service under the Turkish rulers who dominated much of the Middle East. His father, Najm al-Din Ayyub, and his uncle, Asad al-Din Shirkuh, both served the powerful Turkish ruler Nur ad-Din, who controlled much of Syria and who dedicated himself to uniting the Muslim world against the Crusader presence in the Levant. The young Saladin, whose name means righteousness of the faith, grew up in Damascus and Baalbek, absorbing the culture and learning of the Islamic world. Unlike many great warriors, Saladin as a youth showed more interest in religious studies and intellectual pursuits than in military training. He studied the Quran and Islamic law, developed an appreciation for poetry and literature, and seemed destined for a career as a religious scholar or administrator, rather than as a military commander. Fate, however, had different plans for him. Saladin's path to power began in Egypt, a land whose strategic importance could hardly be overstated. Egypt was the wealthiest territory in the entire region, blessed with the annual flooding of the Nile River that brought fertility to its fields and prosperity to its people. The country produced enormous agricultural surpluses, controlled important trade routes, and possessed the resources to field large armies. For decades, Egypt had been ruled by the Fatimid Caliphate, a Shiite Muslim dynasty that had grown increasingly weak and divided by the mid-12th century. Both Nur ad-Din in Syria and King Amalric of Jerusalem recognized that whoever controlled Egypt would dominate the entire region. This led to a complex three-way struggle in the 1160s, with Syrian forces, Frankish armies, and Egyptian factions all vying for control. Saladin's uncle Shirkuh led several military expeditions to Egypt on behalf of Nur ad-Din, and the young Saladin accompanied him, gaining military experience and developing an understanding of Egyptian politics. The situation in Egypt was Byzantine in its complexity. The Fatimid Caliphate was nominally led by a young caliph named Al-Adid, but real power was wielded by various viziers and generals who competed for influence. Shawar, one of these powerful viziers, had been overthrown and sought help from Nur ad-Din to regain his position. Shirkuh led an army to Egypt and did indeed restore Shawar to power. But then Shawar betrayed his benefactors and allied with King Amalric of Jerusalem against the Syrian forces. This began a period of bewildering reversals, with alliances forming and dissolving, armies marching back and forth, and Egyptian politics descending into chaos. Shirkuh led multiple expeditions to Egypt, sometimes fighting against both the Fatimids and the Franks, sometimes allying with one against the other. Through all of this, Saladin learned the arts of war, diplomacy, and political maneuvering that would serve him so well in later years. The decisive turning point came in 1169. Shirkuh led yet another army to Egypt, this time achieving complete success. Shawar was eliminated, and Shirkuh became the new vizier, the power behind the Fatimid throne. But Shirkuh's triumph was short-lived. Within weeks of achieving this position, he died suddenly, possibly from a heart attack brought on by his excessive eating, a vice that had made him corpulent and unhealthy. With Shirkuh's unexpected death, the question arose of who would succeed him as vizier. To the surprise of many, the choice fell upon Saladin, who at age 31 was relatively young and inexperienced compared to other candidates. But Saladin had proven himself capable during the Egyptian campaigns, and he had the crucial advantage of being Shirkuh's nephew, and therefore acceptable to Nur ad-Din. The young Caliph Al-Adid confirmed the appointment, and Saladin became vizier of Egypt, the most powerful position in the land after the Caliph himself. Saladin moved quickly to consolidate his power. He placed family members and trusted followers in key positions throughout the Egyptian government and military. He built up his own military forces, recruiting extensively and creating a power base that was loyal to him personally, rather than to the distant Nur ad-Din or the figurehead caliph. He handled the economy skillfully, ensuring that revenues flowed smoothly and that the various interest groups in Egyptian society were kept satisfied or at least neutralized. In 1171, Saladin took a momentous step that would reshape the religious and political landscape of the region. The Fatimid Caliphate was Shiite, following a different interpretation of Islam than the Sunni Muslims, who dominated most of the Islamic world. This religious division had kept Egypt politically isolated and had weakened the unity of the Muslim response to the Crusader presence. When the Caliph Al-Adid died in 1171, Saladin did not recognize his successor Instead, he declared Egypt's return to Sunni Islam and recognized the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad as the supreme religious authority. This religious transformation was presented as a restoration of true Islam, a healing of the schism that had divided the Muslim community. In practical terms, it aligned Egypt with the broader Sunni Muslim world and eliminated a major source of division that had hampered united action against the Crusaders. It also earned Saladin enormous prestige throughout the Muslim world, establishing him as a champion of religious orthodoxy and Islamic unity. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, the same year that King Amalric died and Baldwin IV became King of Jerusalem, Saladin faced a critical decision. Technically, he was Nur ad-Din's subordinate, ruling Egypt on behalf of his master. With Nur ad-Din dead, leaving only a young son as heir, Saladin could have acknowledged the son's authority and continued as a loyal subordinate. Instead, Saladin chose to strike out on his own, claiming that he was better positioned to lead the jihad against the Crusaders and that the unity of the Muslim world required strong leadership. Saladin marched from Egypt to Syria with an army and took control of Damascus in 1174. Over the next several years, he systematically brought the other major cities of Syria, Aleppo, Homs, Hama, under his control, sometimes through diplomacy and sometimes through military force. He faced opposition from other Muslim rulers who saw him as a usurper and who resented his claim to lead the jihad. But Saladin was persistent, skilled in both warfare and politics, and gradually he built a realm that stretched from Egypt through the Sinai Peninsula, Palestine and Syria, all the way to northern Mesopotamia. By the late 1170s, when Baldwin IV was beginning his personal reign, Saladin had become the single most powerful Muslim ruler in the region. He controlled territories that surrounded the Crusader states on nearly all sides. He could draw on the wealth of Egypt, the manpower of Syria, and the religious fervor of Muslims who saw him as the leader who would finally expel the Frankish invaders from the Holy Land. Saladin's success rested on several foundations. He was an extremely capable military commander, skilled in both siege warfare and open battle, able to coordinate large armies and adapt his tactics to circumstances. He was also an astute politician who understood how to build and maintain alliances, how to use marriage ties to bind families together, and how to present himself as the champion of Islamic unity and the leader of the jihad. Perhaps most importantly, Saladin cultivated an image of himself as a pious, just, and generous ruler who embodied the virtues that Islam taught. He presented himself as fighting not for personal glory or territorial gain, but for the glory of God and the liberation of Jerusalem, the third holiest city in Islam after Mecca and Medina. This religious framing of his ambitions gave him legitimacy and helped rally support across the Muslim world. Contemporary accounts describe Saladin as personally devout, praying regularly, fasting, and living relatively simply, despite the enormous wealth at his disposal. He was known for his generosity, often giving away money to the poor and to religious scholars. He patronized mosques and religious schools, supported Sufi mystics, and surrounded himself with learned men who could advise him on religious law. Whether this piety was entirely genuine or partly calculated for political effect is impossible to say with certainty, but it was certainly effective in building his reputation. Saladin also demonstrated political sophistication in his dealings with the various factions within the Muslim world. He married Nur ad-Din's widow, Ismat al-Din Khatun, which gave him a claim to legitimacy as Nur ad-Din's successor. He carefully cultivated good relations with the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, the nominal leader of the Sunni Muslim world, receiving from him the formal title of Sultan of Egypt and Syria. He dealt skillfully with the various Turkish, Kurdish, and Arab military leaders, who commanded forces throughout his realm, balancing their competing interests and ambitions. At the same time, Saladin understood the importance of military strength. He built up a formidable army that combined different elements: his own elite personal guards, mostly Turkish and Kurdish cavalry called Mamluks, regular cavalry units drawn from Syria and Egypt, infantry forces, and auxiliary units. His army was capable of conducting multiple campaigns simultaneously, besieging fortresses while also engaging in open battle, maintaining the supply lines necessary for extended operations. Saladin's strategy toward the Crusader states was patient and methodical. Unlike some earlier Muslim leaders who had launched single great campaigns hoping to destroy the Franks in one blow, Saladin understood that the Crusader kingdoms were resilient and well fortified. His approach was to gradually increase pressure, to take fortresses one by one, to win battles that would weaken the Crusader military strength, and to use diplomacy to prevent the Crusader states from receiving significant reinforcements from Europe. He also worked to prevent the Crusader states from exploiting divisions within the Muslim world. Previous Crusader successes had often come from playing Muslim rulers against each other, forming alliances with some Muslim leaders against others. By uniting Syria and Egypt under his own rule, Saladin eliminated the most significant division that the Crusaders had been able to exploit. The Kingdom of Jerusalem now faced a unified Muslim power that controlled the territories on multiple sides, a strategic nightmare for the Crusader leadership. The personal rivalry between Saladin and Baldwin IV that would develop over the course of the 1170s and 1180s was in many ways a study in contrasts. Saladin was healthy, vigorous, and mature, a man in his 30s and 40s at the height of his powers. Baldwin was young, diseased, and physically declining, fighting not just against external enemies, but against his own body. Saladin commanded vast resources and large armies. Baldwin ruled a small kingdom with limited manpower and constant financial difficulties. Yet despite all these disadvantages, Baldwin would prove to be a far more formidable opponent than Saladin initially anticipated. The Leper King possessed qualities that Saladin could not match: an intimate knowledge of the local terrain, the desperate courage of someone who knew he was dying and had nothing to lose, and a political legitimacy that kept his fractious nobles united behind him, even when they disagreed with his policies. The contest between these two men would produce some of the most dramatic moments in the entire history of the Crusades. Muslim chroniclers who wrote about this period would later express grudging respect for Baldwin, acknowledging that despite his youth and illness, he was a formidable adversary who repeatedly frustrated Saladin's plans. Christian chroniclers, for their part, saw Baldwin's successes against Saladin as evidence of divine favor, proof that God supported the Christian cause even through the most unlikely of instruments. As the year 1177 progressed, Saladin was planning his most ambitious campaign yet against the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He had secured his control over Egypt and Syria, assembled a large and experienced army, and identified what seemed like the perfect moment to strike. When the Crusader forces were divided, their king was sick and weakened, and their leadership was in disarray. Everything pointed to a great Muslim victory that would deal a devastating, perhaps fatal blow to the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. Saladin could not have known that he was about to face one of the most stunning defeats of his entire career at the hands of a 16-year-old Leper King who should have been, by all reasonable calculation, an easy opponent to defeat. The Battle of Montgisard was approaching, and it would change both men's lives and reputations forever. November of 1177 arrived with clear skies and the pleasant temperatures that characterize autumn in the Holy Land. For the Kingdom of Jerusalem, however, the season brought not peace but the gravest danger the realm had faced in years. Saladin had assembled a formidable army in Egypt and was preparing to launch a major offensive against the Crusader territories. The Muslim Sultan's strategic calculations seemed sound. The Frankish forces were dispersed, with Count Philip of Flanders, Count Raymond of Tripoli, and Prince Bohemond of Antioch, all engaged in operations far to the north around the city of Hama. Jerusalem itself was left defended by only a skeleton force. King Baldwin, still recovering from the illness that had nearly killed him earlier that year, was acutely aware of the kingdom's vulnerability. When reports reached him in Jerusalem that Saladin had crossed from Egypt into Palestine with a large army, the young king faced a terrible choice. He could remain behind the walls of Jerusalem, husband his meager forces, and hope that Saladin would not press an attack on the heavily fortified capital city. This would be the safe choice, the prudent choice, the choice that most advisors would recommend for a sick teenager facing one of the greatest generals of the age. But Baldwin did not choose safety. Despite his illness, despite his youth, despite having only a fraction of the forces that Saladin commanded, Baldwin decided to take the field and oppose the invasion. This decision speaks volumes about his character and his understanding of kingship. He knew that if he cowered in Jerusalem while Saladin ravaged the kingdom, he would lose the respect of his nobles and the confidence of his people. A king, even a sick king, even a young king, had to lead. A king who hid while his kingdom burned was no king at all. On November 18, 1177, while still recovering from his illness, Baldwin rode out from Jerusalem, accompanied by Raynald of Chatillon, whom he had appointed as regent during his sickness, and by whatever knights and soldiers could be quickly assembled. According to William of Tyre, the most reliable contemporary chronicler, Baldwin's force consisted of only 375 knights, a pitifully small number compared to the thousands that Saladin commanded. To these professional warriors were added some infantry, including crossbowmen and foot soldiers. But even with these additions, Baldwin's army was vastly outnumbered. The king also sent urgent messages to the Knights Templar, who maintained a fortress at Gaza on the coast. The Templars, one of the two great military religious orders that served as the professional fighting corps of the Crusader armies, answered the call. Odo de Saint-Amand, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, led his knights out from Gaza to rendezvous with the royal army. The Templars brought perhaps 80 fully equipped knights to the battle, a significant addition that still left Baldwin's forces hopelessly outnumbered. Baldwin's small army made its way to Ascalon, the coastal fortress that had been the last Fatimid stronghold before King Baldwin III captured it in 1153. Ascalon was strategically positioned on the road between Egypt and the heartland of the Crusader kingdom, making it a natural place to try to intercept Saladin's invasion. When the Muslim army approached Ascalon, Saladin made a tactical decision that would prove to be catastrophic. Instead of concentrating his forces to overwhelm the Crusader garrison, he detached only a portion of his army to contain Ascalon, while the bulk of his forces continued northward toward Jerusalem. This division of forces reflected Saladin's calculation that the small Crusader force in Ascalon posed no real threat to his much larger army. Why waste time besieging the fortress when it could be masked with a screening force while the main army proceeded to more important objectives? Saladin's strategic goal was not to fight Baldwin's tiny army, but to seize territory, capture fortresses, and perhaps even take Jerusalem itself, while the Crusader forces remained scattered and unable to concentrate. From Ascalon, Saladin's army continued its advance northward, spreading out across the countryside to forage and plunder. The Muslim forces raided villages, captured supplies, and conducted the kind of devastation that was typical of medieval warfare. Saladin's plan seemed to be working perfectly. He had penetrated deep into Crusader territory. His army was living off the land and enriching itself with plunder. and the main Crusader forces remained far away in northern Syria, unable to respond in time to prevent the destruction. But Saladin had made a critical miscalculation. He had underestimated Baldwin's courage and determination. Despite being vastly outnumbered, despite being sick and weak, despite conventional military wisdom suggesting that he should remain in Ascalon behind its strong walls, Baldwin decided to take aggressive action. The young king issued an arriere ban, a general call to arms that required every able-bodied man in the region to join the army. This was typically reserved for the most desperate emergencies, and it brought in men who were not professional soldiers, townsmen, farmers, craftsmen, anyone who could carry a weapon and follow orders. Baldwin also made a crucial tactical decision. Rather than marching directly after Saladin's main force, which would simply have allowed the Muslim army to turn and destroy his much smaller force in a conventional battle, Baldwin instead maneuvered to follow Saladin's line of march while staying out of direct contact. He was shadowing the Muslim army, waiting for an opportunity, looking for some moment of vulnerability that could be exploited. The opportunity came on November 25th, 1177, near a place called Montgisard, also known as Tel al-Jezza or Montgisard. The exact location of the battle has been debated by historians, but it was somewhere in the region between Ramla and Ibelin, probably near modern-day Tel Safi. The specific location matters less than what happened there. One of the most dramatic military encounters of the entire crusading era. Saladin's army had become overconfident and careless. The Muslim forces had spread out over a wide area, with units scattered across the countryside foraging, collecting supplies, and entertaining themselves with plunder. The baggage train was stuck in mud, slowing the entire force. Different units had lost contact with each other, and the army as a whole lacked the tight organization and immediate readiness that was essential when enemy forces were nearby. Saladin himself, convinced that Baldwin's tiny force posed no serious threat, had allowed his army to become dispersed and vulnerable. Baldwin, guided by local nobles who knew the terrain intimately, particularly Baldwin of Ibelin and his brother Balian, whose lands included this region, maneuvered his small force into position for a surprise attack. The Crusader army approached through terrain that concealed their movement, using hills and valleys to mask their advance. When they finally came within striking distance of Saladin's scattered forces, Baldwin made the decision to attack immediately, before the Muslim army could concentrate and organize its superior numbers. What happened next has been described by multiple chroniclers, both Christian and Muslim, and while details vary, all accounts agree on the essential facts. Baldwin IV, a 16-year-old boy whose body was being destroyed by leprosy, personally led his knights in a desperate cavalry charge against Saladin's army. The king was in the forefront of the attack, not commanding from a safe distance, but actually fighting in the thick of the battle. The Crusader charge struck Saladin's army like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. The Muslim forces, scattered and unprepared, were caught completely off guard. The heavily armoured Frankish knights, charging in tight formation with lances levelled, smashed into Muslim units that were not formed up for battle. The shock of the impact, combined with the complete surprise, created immediate chaos in Saladin's army. Reynaud of Châtillon, serving as Baldwin's second in command, directed much of the cavalry action, using his experience to exploit the confusion in the Muslim ranks. The Templar Knights, disciplined and ferocious in battle, maintained their cohesion and cut through enemy formations with devastating effect. The infantry, including the hastily raised townsmen and farmers who had answered the arriere ban, fought with the desperation of men who knew they were defending their homes and families. Saladin tried frantically to rally his scattered forces, to bring some organization to the chaos. He managed to form a battle line with his nephew Taqi ad-Din commanding one wing, attempting to use a nearby hill for defensive advantage. But the damage had already been done. The surprise had been complete. The initial momentum had shattered the cohesion of the Muslim army, and now panic began to spread through the ranks. The battle quickly became a rout. Muslim soldiers, unable to form effective resistance against the charging Frankish knights, began to flee. The attempted retreat became a disorganized stampede as men abandoned their positions and weapons, seeking only to escape with their lives. The Christian forces pursued the fleeing Muslims for miles, cutting down those they caught and capturing others. The baggage train, which had been such a hindrance to Saladin's movement, now fell entirely into Christian hands, an enormous prize that included supplies, weapons, and treasure. The slaughter was terrible. Contemporary estimates suggest that Saladin lost the vast majority of his army. Only about 1/10 of the forces he had brought from Egypt managed to escape and make their way back across the Sinai. Saladin himself barely escaped capture, famously riding a racing camel at top speed to get away from the pursuing crusaders. His nephew's son, Ahmad, was killed in the fighting. Many of his most experienced commanders were captured or killed. The defeat was so complete and so humiliating that it shook Saladin's reputation throughout the Muslim world. For Baldwin, the victory at Montgisard was the defining triumph of his reign. Against overwhelming odds, a sick teenager with a tiny army had defeated the most powerful Muslim ruler of the age. The victory saved Jerusalem from immediate threat, captured enormous amounts of supplies and booty, and demonstrated that Saladin was not invincible. The battle gave the kingdom of Jerusalem years of breathing room, as Saladin had to rebuild his forces and restore his reputation before he could launch another major offensive. Baldwin commemorated his victory by founding a Benedictine monastery on the battlefield, dedicated to St. Catherine of Alexandria, whose feast day fell on November 25th, the day of the battle. This monastery served as a permanent reminder of the miracle that had occurred there, the victory that many Christians saw as divine intervention on behalf of their Leper King. The psychological impact of Montgisard cannot be overstated. For the Crusader kingdom, which had been facing potential annihilation, the victory provided hope and validation. It proved that strong leadership and courage could overcome tremendous disadvantages. It demonstrated that Baldwin, despite his disease, was a capable war leader who could inspire his men and make sound tactical decisions under pressure. The victory cemented Baldwin's authority and silenced those nobles who might have questioned whether a leper should continue to reign. For Saladin, Montgisard was a disaster that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Muslim chroniclers would later write that this defeat was so severe that it was only redeemed by Saladin's victory 10 years later at the Battle of Hattin. The battle demonstrated that underestimating the Crusaders, and especially underestimating Baldwin IV, was a dangerous mistake. Saladin would face Baldwin multiple times in the years ahead, and he would never again treat the Leper King as an insignificant opponent. The Battle of Montgisard has sometimes been oversimplified in popular accounts, reduced to a simple story of miraculous victory. But the reality was more complex, and in some ways more impressive. Baldwin's victory was not purely due to luck or divine intervention. It resulted from sound military judgment, choosing to take offensive action rather than cowering defensively, shadowing the enemy army until it became vulnerable, timing the attack for maximum surprise, and maintaining discipline during the charge and pursuit. These were the actions of a skilled commander, not a lucky amateur. The victory also came at a cost. Roger de Moulins, Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller, reported casualties of 1,100 killed and 750 wounded, significant losses even in victory. Baldwin himself fought despite his illness, his hands bound to his weapons and reins to compensate for his loss of sensation. The physical and mental strain of the battle must have been tremendous for a 16-year-old already weakened by disease. In the aftermath of Montgisard, Baldwin's reputation soared. Word of the victory spread throughout the Christian world, with chroniclers and letter writers carrying the news to Europe. The Leper King, who had defeated Saladin, became a subject of wonder and admiration. European princes and nobles who had questioned the viability of the Kingdom of Jerusalem under a diseased young king now saw that the realm still had fight in it, that its leadership was competent and courageous. The victory also had important diplomatic consequences. Raymond of Tripoli, Bohemond of Antioch, and Philip of Flanders, who had all been conducting operations in northern Syria, while Baldwin faced Saladin alone, returned to find that the young king had won a stunning victory without their help. This could not help but raise Baldwin's stature relative to these powerful nobles, demonstrating that he was not merely a figurehead who depended on their support, but a capable leader in his own right. Saladin, meanwhile, retreated to Egypt to rebuild and reflect on his defeat. He had learned important lessons at Montgisard about the dangers of overconfidence, about the fighting qualities of the Frankish knights when properly led, and about the surprising capabilities of the young Leper King. When Saladin next faced Baldwin in battle, he would be far more cautious and prepared. But for now, in the winter of 1177-1178, the Sultan needed time to recover, regroup, and restore his damaged reputation. The victory at Montgisard bought the Kingdom of Jerusalem precious time to strengthen fortifications, time to attempt diplomatic initiatives, time to hope that reinforcements might arrive from Europe. But time was something that Baldwin himself did not have in abundance. Even as he celebrated his greatest victory, the leprosy in his body continued its relentless progression. The young king who had fought so bravely at Montgisard knew that his greatest enemy was not Saladin's armies, but the disease that was slowly destroying him from within. In the months and years following the triumph at Montgisard, Baldwin IV demonstrated that he understood warfare was not merely about winning battles, but about controlling territory, securing supply lines, and denying strategic advantages to one's enemies. The victory had bought the kingdom time and breathing space, but Baldwin knew that Saladin would return, that the reprieve was temporary, and that the kingdom needed to use this time to strengthen its defenses and prepare for future conflicts. One of Baldwin's most important strategic initiatives was the construction of a castle at Jacob's Ford, a crucial crossing point of the Jordan River. Jacob's Ford, known in Arabic as Beit al-Azan, was the most reliable place to cross the Jordan between the territories controlled by Saladin in Damascus and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Whoever controlled this ford controlled a major invasion route, and its strategic importance could hardly be overstated. After his victory at Montgisard, Baldwin understood that he needed to establish a permanent fortification at this site to prevent Saladin from using it as an easy invasion route in future campaigns. A strong castle at Jacob's Ford would serve multiple purposes. It would block or at least delay enemy armies trying to cross the Jordan. It would serve as a base for Christian raids into Muslim territory, and it would effectively create a frontier by controlling and policing the surrounding area. Baldwin commissioned the construction of the castle, and work began in earnest. The project was expensive and required significant resources in terms of both money and labor. Stone had to be quarried and transported to the site. Engineers had to design fortifications that could withstand siege warfare. Garrisons had to be recruited and supplied. The castle was being built in a contested zone, under threat from Saladin's forces, which made the construction even more challenging and dangerous. Saladin recognized immediately how dangerous this castle would be to his strategic position. If the fortress at Jacob's Ford was completed and fully garrisoned, it would severely constrain his ability to move forces between Egypt and Syria. It would also serve as a permanent irritant, a base from which Christian forces could raid his territories. The Sultan decided he had to prevent the castle's completion at almost any cost. In 1179, Saladin marched on Jacob's Ford with a large army while the castle was still under construction. What followed was a brief but intense siege. The Muslim forces assaulted the partially completed fortifications, using siege engines and direct assault to try to overwhelm the defenders before they could complete their defensive works. The fighting was fierce, with both sides suffering significant casualties. Baldwin attempted to relieve the siege, but by the time the royal army could arrive, Saladin had already succeeded in capturing and destroying the castle. The fortifications that had been so painstakingly constructed were systematically dismantled. The garrison that had defended the site was killed or captured. The attempt to secure Jacob's Ford had failed, at least for the time being, and Baldwin had to accept this strategic setback. The loss of Jacob's Ford was followed by another significant military engagement later in 1179. At the Battle of Montgisard, near the Litani River in what is now southern Lebanon, Baldwin's forces suffered a defeat at Saladin's hands. The battle came about when Odo de Saint-Amand, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, engaged a Muslim raiding force without waiting for coordination with the main royal army. This impetuous action led to a larger engagement in which Saladin's superior cavalry forces were able to outmaneuver and defeat the Christian army. The defeat at Montgisard resulted in significant losses for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Odo de Saint-Amand himself was captured, along with many other knights. Baldwin and Raymond of Tripoli barely escaped capture and had to retreat to the safety of Beaufort Castle and then further to Tiberias. The battle demonstrated the limits of Crusader military power when facing Saladin's reorganized and better prepared armies. These setbacks, the failure at Jacob's Ford and the defeat at Montgisard, showed that the victory at Montgisard had not permanently resolved the strategic challenges facing the kingdom. Saladin had learned from his defeat, had rebuilt his forces, and was once again capable of achieving victories against the Crusaders. The cycle of warfare, temporary truces, and renewed conflict would continue throughout Baldwin's reign. In 1180, recognizing that the kingdom needed time to recover from its recent setbacks and that his own health was deteriorating, Baldwin negotiated a 2-year truce with Saladin. This truce was a pragmatic recognition of realities. Neither side had the strength to achieve a decisive victory, and both could benefit from a period of peace to rebuild and reorganize. The truce did not include the county of Tripoli, which meant Saladin could still conduct operations in northern Syria, but it provided the Kingdom of Jerusalem proper with a much-needed respite. During this period of relative peace, Baldwin focused on internal affairs and on the increasingly urgent problem of his succession. His health was clearly worsening. By 1180, the physical effects of leprosy were becoming impossible to hide or minimize. His hands were significantly impaired. His face was marked by lesions, and his overall physical strength was declining. The question of who would succeed him became more pressing with each passing month. Baldwin's strategy for securing the succession centered on his sister Sibylla, who had remained a widow since the death of William of Montferrat in 1177. In October of 1177, Sibylla had given birth to a son, named Baldwin after his uncle, providing at least a male heir even if the boy's father was dead. But Sibylla herself needed a husband who could serve as king consort and protector of the realm, someone who could command armies and govern effectively when Baldwin died. The politics surrounding Sibylla's remarriage were treacherous. Various factions within the kingdom had different candidates they favoured, and there were also concerns about foreign intervention. Would Sibylla be married to someone from Europe who might try to dominate the kingdom's affairs? During the Easter celebrations of 1180, a political crisis erupted that would have profound consequences for the kingdom's future. Raymond of Tripoli and Bohemond of Antioch, two of the most powerful nobles in the Crusader states, arrived in Jerusalem with large military retinues. Their intentions were unclear, but Baldwin and his advisors suspected that they were planning to force the king to accept their choice of husband for Sibylla, possibly even to compel Baldwin to abdicate in favour of a more robust monarch. The historian Bernard Hamilton suggests that Raymond and Bohemond likely wanted Sibylla married to Baldwin of Ibelin, a respected local noble whose family would then be positioned to dominate the kingdom. King Baldwin, despite his illness and youth, acted decisively to forestall this potential coup. Before Raymond and Bohemond could make their move, Baldwin arranged for Sibylla to marry Guy de Lusignan, a French knight who had recently arrived in the kingdom as part of the retinue of his older brother Aymery. Guy was not the most prestigious match. He came from a family of middling importance in Poitou, but he had certain advantages from Baldwin's perspective. First, Guy had no independent power base in the kingdom, which meant he would be entirely dependent on royal favour and therefore presumably loyal to Baldwin. Second, Guy's brother Aymery had already established himself at court and apparently enjoyed the favour of Agnes of Courtenay, Baldwin's mother, which suggested that the Lusignan brothers would align with the Courtenay family faction. Third, marrying Sibylla quickly to someone, even if not the ideal candidate, would prevent Raymond and Bohemond from imposing their own choice on the kingdom. The marriage of Sibylla and Guy took place in April of 1180, effectively presenting Raymond and Bohemond with a fait accompli. When they arrived for the Easter celebrations, they had no choice but to accept the marriage, though they clearly resented being outmaneuvered by the young Leper King. The episode demonstrated that Baldwin, despite his physical limitations, was politically astute and capable of acting decisively when necessary. However, the marriage to Guy de Lusignan would prove to be one of the most fateful and ultimately disastrous decisions of Baldwin's reign, though not because of anything Baldwin did wrong in his calculations at the time. Guy would prove to be catastrophically incompetent as a military commander and would contribute significantly to the destruction of the Kingdom of Jerusalem after Baldwin's death. But in 1180, these failures lay in the future, and Baldwin had reasonable grounds for making the choice he did. With Sibylla married to Guy, and the succession seemingly secured for the moment, Baldwin turned his attention back to the constant challenges of governing a kingdom surrounded by enemies and riven by internal factions. The truce with Saladin was holding, but everyone knew it was temporary. Both sides were using the peace to prepare for the inevitable renewal of warfare. Baldwin's own physical condition continued to decline throughout 1180 and 1181. The disease was progressing inexorably, affecting his vision, his mobility, and his overall health. Yet he continued to fulfill his royal duties as best he could, presiding at court, making decisions, and maintaining his authority over the fractious nobility of the kingdom. His determination to continue ruling despite his deteriorating condition was remarkable and commanded respect, even from those who disagreed with his policies. The truce with Saladin was broken in mid-1181 by Reynold of Chatillon, who had become Lord of Querec and Montreal through his marriage to Stephanie of Milly. From his fortress of Querec, which commanded the road between Egypt and Syria, Reynold launched an attack on a Muslim caravan that was travelling through the region. This raid was a direct violation of the truce, and Saladin demanded that Baldwin make Reynold return the plunder and provide compensation for the attack. Baldwin did indeed order Reynold to comply with Saladin's demands and to observe the truce. But Reynold, who held his lands in feudal tenure, but who was also an independent-minded and aggressive lord, refused to obey the king's command. He kept the plunder from the caravan raid and continued to attack Muslim travelers and trade. This defiance of royal authority was deeply problematic for Baldwin, but there was little the king could do to force compliance. Reynold controlled powerful fortresses, commanded his own military forces, and had the backing of the Templar Order and other nobles who favoured aggressive action against Saladin. Reynold's actions, while problematic diplomatically, did serve a strategic purpose. His raids disrupted Saladin's communications between Egypt and Syria, interfered with Muslim trade, and generally made life more difficult for the Sultan. Some modern historians, notably Bernard Hamilton, have argued that Reynold's aggressive stance was actually strategically sound, keeping Saladin off balance and preventing him from concentrating his forces for a major offensive. Whether this justifies breaking the truce is debatable, but it's clear that Reynold's actions were not simply reckless piracy, but were at least partly motivated by strategic calculations. Saladin used Reynold's truce-breaking as justification for resuming full-scale hostilities. Through the rest of 1181 and 1182, warfare between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and Saladin's forces resumed in earnest. There were raids, counter-raids, and several significant battles. Baldwin, despite his worsening condition, continued to lead his armies in person when necessary, understanding that his physical presence was essential to maintaining morale and authority. In 1182, Baldwin achieved another significant victory over Saladin at the Battle of Leprosy. Once again, the young king demonstrated his military competence, outmaneuvering Saladin's forces and achieving a tactical success that prevented Muslim forces from achieving their objectives in Galilee. This victory, while not as dramatic or complete as Montgisard, further demonstrated that Baldwin remained a formidable opponent, even as his disease progressed. However, the cumulative effect of constant warfare, combined with the progression of his leprosy, was taking a terrible toll on Baldwin's body. By 1183, he was facing the most severe physical limitations he had yet experienced, and the political and military challenges facing the kingdom were about to reach a critical point. By the year 1183, Baldwin IV had reigned for 9 years, far longer than most observers had expected when he was crowned as a 13-year-old boy with leprosy. But these 9 years had exacted a terrible price on his body. The disease that had first manifested as a loss of sensation in his right arm when he was 9 years old had now progressed to the point where Baldwin was suffering from multiple debilitating symptoms that made it increasingly difficult for him to function as king. Baldwin's hands were now severely affected by the disease. The loss of sensation meant that he could not feel when he injured himself, leading to repeated wounds that often became infected. The bacterial infection caused by leprosy had damaged the nerves and tissues in his fingers, leading to contractures and deformities that made it almost impossible for him to grip weapons or even to hold the reins of a horse properly. His face bore the unmistakable marks of leprosy, nodules and lesions that disfigured his features and made his appearance shocking to those who saw him for the first time. Most devastating of all, Baldwin's vision was beginning to fail. The bacteria that caused leprosy had invaded the delicate tissues of his eyes, causing inflammation and damage to the nerves that control sight. By 1183, Baldwin was experiencing significant vision problems that would progress to complete blindness. For a warrior king who needed to see the battlefield, assess tactical situations, and lead troops in person, this loss of vision was catastrophic. The progressive nature of Baldwin's illness made the question of succession increasingly urgent with each passing month. His nephew, young Baldwin, the son of Sibylla, and her late first husband William of Montferrat, was growing up but remained a child. Sibylla's second husband, Guy de Lusignan, was positioning himself as the future king, but his suitability for this role was increasingly questioned by many of the kingdom's most important nobles. In June of 1183, with his health deteriorating rapidly and fever racking his body, Baldwin IV made what seemed like a logical decision given his circumstances. He appointed Guy de Lusignan as regent of the kingdom and gave him command of the military forces. Guy was, after all, married to the heir presumptive, was presumably loyal to the crown, and claimed to have military experience. The appointment was meant to be a test, to see if Guy could handle the responsibilities of leadership before he eventually became king in his own right. The test would reveal Guy de Lusignan to be spectacularly unsuited for the role. What happened next would be a turning point in Baldwin's reign and would have profound consequences for the future of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Saladin, who had been carefully watching for opportunities to strike at the Crusader states, launched a major invasion in the summer of 1183, capturing the important city of Aleppo and completing the encirclement of the Christian territories. With Aleppo in his hands, Saladin controlled a continuous arc of territory from Egypt through Palestine and Syria, all the way to northern Mesopotamia. The strategic noose around the Crusader states had tightened significantly. In response to this threat, Guy de Lusignan assembled the army of Jerusalem and marched to confront Saladin. The two armies came within sight of each other, positioned for battle. Everything seemed set for a major engagement that could determine the fate of the kingdom. The Crusader army was not insignificant. Guy had managed to gather a substantial force, including contingents from the military orders and levies from the various baronies. If properly led, this army could at least fight a defensive battle and perhaps prevent Saladin from achieving his immediate objectives. But then something extraordinary happened. Or rather, something failed to happen. Guy de Lusignan, when faced with the actual prospect of battle against Saladin's larger army, lost his nerve. Despite having the forces available, despite the expectation that he would engage the enemy, Guy refused to give the order to attack. He also refused to advance or to take any meaningful military action. The two armies remained facing each other for days, with Guy apparently paralyzed by indecision or fear, unwilling to fight but also unwilling to retreat. This failure of leadership was catastrophic. The army stood in the field, consuming supplies and accomplishing nothing, while Saladin's forces were free to maneuver and raid. Eventually, without achieving anything, Guy led the army back towards safety, but the damage to his reputation was immense and permanent. The nobles and knights who had served under him saw firsthand that Guy de Lusignan was not a military leader worthy of commanding the kingdom's forces. He had neither the tactical skill nor the personal courage that the situation demanded. Count Raymond of Tripoli, who had been present during this debacle, was particularly scathing in his criticism. Raymond had never supported Guy's marriage to Sibylla, viewing him as an upstart foreigner who had married above his station, and this military failure confirmed all of Raymond's worst suspicions. But even those nobles who had been willing to give Guy the benefit of the doubt before this campaign were now convinced that he was incompetent. When word of Guy's failure reached Baldwin IV, who was lying sick in Jerusalem, the king was reportedly furious. Despite his illness, despite the fever that was ravaging his body, Baldwin's mind remained sharp, and his commitment to the kingdom's welfare remained paramount. He recognized immediately that Guy's incompetence posed a mortal threat to the realm. If Guy became king, he would likely lead the kingdom to disaster through his military ineptitude and political weakness. Baldwin made a decision that was both courageous and politically astute, though it would create enormous complications for the succession. He stripped Guy of the regency, reclaiming personal authority over the kingdom despite his physical limitations. This was an extraordinary act. A king who could barely see, who could not walk without assistance, who was visibly dying of a horrible disease, was taking back full control of the government from his designated regent and brother-in-law. But Baldwin understood that incompetent leadership would doom the kingdom faster than having a leper king who could barely function physically, but who still possessed the mental capacity to make sound decisions. The reclamation of authority put Baldwin in a difficult position regarding the succession. Guy was still married to Sibylla, which meant that when Baldwin died and Sibylla became queen, Guy would presumably become king consort with full royal authority. Baldwin needed to find a way to prevent this outcome without creating a succession crisis that would tear the kingdom apart. The solution he devised was both clever and constitutional. He would crown Sibylla's young son, Baldwin IV, as co-king while Baldwin IV was still alive, and he would arrange for the regency after his death to go to Raymond of Tripoli rather than to Guy. While Baldwin was dealing with the succession crisis and Guy's failure of leadership, Raynald of Chatillon was planning and executing one of the most audacious military operations of the entire Crusader period. From his fortress of Kerak, which commanded the road between Egypt and Syria, Raynald had been a consistent thorn in Saladin's side, raiding caravans and disrupting Muslim communications. But in late 1182 and early 1183, Raynald conceived of a plan that was breathtaking in its ambition and stunning in its execution. Raynald decided to launch a naval raid on the Red Sea, targeting Muslim shipping and potentially threatening the holy cities of Mecca and Medina themselves. This was an operation of extraordinary boldness, for the Red Sea was deep in Muslim territory, far from any Christian bases, and had never been threatened by Crusader forces. The plan required transporting ships overland across the Sinai Peninsula, launching them in the Red Sea, and then conducting raids along the coast before presumably fighting their way back out or being destroyed in the attempt. The logistics of this operation were complex. Raynald had ships built or acquired on the Mediterranean coast, then had them disassembled and transported piece by piece across the desert to the Gulf of Aqaba, the northern arm of the Red Sea. This required coordination, secrecy, and significant resources. The ships were then reassembled at the coast and launched with crews of Frankish sailors and soldiers. Once in the Red Sea, Raynald's fleet began conducting raids along both the Arabian and African coasts. They attacked Muslim shipping, captured merchant vessels, and raided coastal settlements. The psychological impact of these raids was enormous. Muslims had thought the Red Sea was safe from Christian attack, and the sudden appearance of Frankish raiders spread panic and outrage throughout the Muslim world. Some of the raiding parties even landed and advanced inland toward Medina, though they did not reach the city itself. The very threat to Medina, one of the two holiest cities in Islam and the burial place of the Prophet Muhammad, was considered an outrageous sacrilege by Muslims throughout the region. Saladin was both enraged and deeply embarrassed that Christian raiders had penetrated so far into what should have been secure Muslim territory. Saladin responded by dispatching naval forces from Egypt to hunt down Raynald's fleet. The Muslim ships eventually caught up with the Christian raiders and destroyed most of the vessels. The Frankish sailors and soldiers who were captured were transported to various Muslim cities, where they were publicly executed, often in deliberately humiliating ways calculated to send a message about the fate of those who dared to threaten the holy cities. Some of the captives were taken to Mecca itself during the annual pilgrimage season and were executed in front of thousands of pilgrims, turning their deaths into public spectacles. Saladin personally swore an oath that he would kill Raynald of Chatillon with his own hands for this violation. This oath was not mere rhetoric. It reflected the genuine rage that Saladin felt about the Red Sea raids and the threat they had posed to Islam's holy places. The Sultan was a pious man who took his role as defender of Islam seriously, and Reynald's actions had struck at the very heart of what Saladin held most sacred. From a strategic perspective, the Red Sea raids accomplished several things. They disrupted Muslim trade and shipping, demonstrating that even areas deep in Muslim territory were not safe from Christian attack. They forced Saladin to divert resources to naval defense, resources that might otherwise have been used for offensive operations against the Crusader states. They also raised the prestige of Reynald himself, who was seen by many Christians as a bold warrior striking fearlessly at the heart of Muslim power. However, the raids also had negative consequences for the Christian cause. They enraged Saladin and the broader Muslim world, making any diplomatic resolution of conflicts more difficult. They provided Saladin with powerful propaganda that he could use to rally support for jihad against the Crusaders, and they personalized the conflict. Saladin now had a specific target for his hatred in the form of Reynald of Chatillon, and this personal animosity would have significant consequences in the future. Baldwin IV's role in the Red Sea raids is somewhat unclear. Some historians suggest that Baldwin must have approved the operation, at least tacitly, since it required such significant resources and preparation that it could hardly have been conducted without the king's knowledge. Others argue that Reynald acted independently, using his authority as Lord of Kerak to conduct operations without seeking royal permission. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Baldwin may have known about the raids and not specifically forbidden them, recognizing that Reynald's aggressive actions served strategic purposes, even if they violated diplomatic norms. Whatever Baldwin's level of involvement, the Red Sea raids became part of the larger pattern of military and diplomatic conflict between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and Saladin's realm. The raids increased tensions and made the eventual resumption of full-scale warfare more likely, but in the short term, they were another demonstration that the Crusader states were still capable of offensive action, still able to surprise and discomfort their Muslim enemies. By late 1183, Baldwin IV's physical condition had deteriorated to a point where he could no longer deny the severity of his limitations. The young king, who had led cavalry charges at Montgisard just 6 years earlier, was now virtually helpless in physical terms. His hands were so damaged by leprosy that he could not hold objects or feed himself. His eyes were failing, with his vision dimming toward total blindness. His face was severely disfigured by the lesions and nodules characteristic of advanced leprosy. His legs were weakening, making it difficult or impossible for him to walk without support. Yet Baldwin's mind remained clear and sharp. He could still make decisions, understand complex political and military situations, and exercise his will as king, even when his body could not carry out his intentions. This disconnect between mental capacity and physical ability created a painful situation. A king who could think and plan and command, but who could not see, could not move freely, could not even care for himself without constant assistance. The practical challenges of governing in this condition were immense. Council meetings had to be conducted with Baldwin unable to see the faces of those speaking to him, forced to rely on recognizing voices and on the honesty of those who described what was happening in the room. When important documents needed to be reviewed or signed, others had to read them aloud and then guide his hand, or more likely, stamp his seal for him with his authorization. When military decisions needed to be made, Baldwin had to rely entirely on the reports of others about enemy movements and positions, unable to personally observe the battlefield or the deployment of troops. Despite these challenges, Baldwin continued to rule and to make crucial decisions about the kingdom's future. In November of 1183, He made one of the most important decisions of his reign. He had his nephew, young Baldwin, crowned as co-king with the title Baldwin IV. The boy was only about 7 years old, far too young to actually govern, but the coronation served crucial purposes. First, it established a clear line of succession that bypassed Guy de Lusignan. Baldwin V was now officially king, even if he could not yet rule in his own right. When Baldwin IV died, there would be no question about who should wear the crown. It would simply remain on the head where it already sat. This reduced the potential for a succession crisis and limited Guy's claim to power. Second, the coronation of Baldwin IV allowed for the establishment of a regency arrangement for after Baldwin IV's death. The young king would need a regent until he came of age, and Baldwin IV arranged for Raymond of Tripoli to fill this role. This gave Raymond, who was competent and experienced, authority to govern after Baldwin IV's death without having to go through Guy de Lusignan or Sibylla. The legal arrangement was complex but ingenious. If young Baldwin V died before reaching maturity, the succession question would be referred to the Pope, the King of France, the King of England, and the Holy Roman Emperor, the great powers of Western Christendom, for their decision. This provision was designed to prevent civil war over the succession and to ensure that any final resolution would have the backing of Europe's most powerful rulers. Guy de Lusignan was explicitly excluded from power by these arrangements. He was not to serve as regent, not to have custody of young Baldwin V, and not to exercise royal authority. This was a devastating blow to Guy's ambitions, but it reflected both his proven incompetence and Baldwin IV's determination to protect the kingdom from poor leadership, even after his own death. In November of 1183, shortly after arranging the coronation of Baldwin V, Baldwin IV faced another military crisis that would test both his own resolve and the kingdom's military capabilities. Saladin laid siege to Kerak, the great fortress controlled by Reynold of Chatillon. The timing was significant. Kerak was hosting celebrations for the wedding of Humphrey XIV of Toron and Isabella, Baldwin's half-sister, daughter of his father Amalric, and his father's second wife, Maria Comnena. The presence of so many nobles at the fortress for the wedding made it an even more attractive target. Saladin's siege of Kerak was serious and sustained. The Muslim forces surrounded the castle, brought up siege engines, and settled in for what they hoped would be a successful reduction of one of the Crusader kingdom's most important fortresses. The garrison and the nobles trapped inside did their best to defend, but the situation was desperate. Food supplies would eventually run out, and without relief, the castle would eventually fall. The responsibility for relieving Kerak fell to Baldwin IV, but the king faced an impossible situation. He was blind and unable to walk, his body consumed by disease. He could not ride a horse in the normal sense, could not see the battlefield, could not even hold a weapon. Yet Baldwin understood that if Kerak fell, and if the nobles trapped they were captured or killed, it would be a catastrophic blow to the kingdom. More importantly, his failure to respond would demonstrate that the kingdom's leadership was paralyzed by his illness, inviting further attacks. Baldwin made the extraordinary decision to go to war anyway. Despite his physical incapacity, he had himself carried on a litter, essentially a bed or stretcher borne by men, or perhaps mounted between horses. This litter allowed him to travel with the army, to be physically present on campaign even though he could not see or fight. The king's presence, even in this limited form, was crucial for maintaining morale and for ensuring that the various contingents of the army would cooperate with each other under a legitimate central authority. The relief force that Baldwin assembled included troops from across the kingdom, contingents from the military orders, and forces provided by the various barons. The army marched toward Kerak, and as Saladin's scouts reported its approach, the Sultan faced a decision. He could maintain the siege and try to take Kerak before the relief force arrived, potentially fighting a battle against Baldwin's army, while also conducting the siege. Or he could lift the siege and withdraw to avoid a potentially costly engagement. Saladin chose to withdraw. The Muslim forces abandoned the siege and retreated before Baldwin's army arrived. The relief of Kerak was accomplished without a major battle, though there were likely skirmishes between the advancing Crusader force and the retreating Muslim army. Kerak was saved, the nobles trapped there were freed, and Baldwin had demonstrated once again that despite his physical incapacity, he remained a force to be reckoned with. The siege of Kerak in 1183 was remarkable, not for military reasons. After all, no great battle was fought, but for what it revealed about Baldwin IV's character and the loyalty he inspired. A king who was blind, unable to walk, carried on a litter by others, had nonetheless mustered an army and marched to war. His physical presence, despite his obvious disabilities, was enough to maintain army cohesion and to convince Saladin that a battle was not worth the risk. This speaks volumes about the respect that Baldwin commanded from both his own nobles and from his Muslim adversary. The year 1184 found Baldwin IV continuing to cling to life and to his throne, but the strain of his illness and the responsibilities of kingship were becoming unbearable. His vision was now almost completely gone, his blindness nearly total. His body was covered with the lesions and ulcers of advanced leprosy. He suffered from frequent fevers that left him weak and delirious. He could not care for himself in even the most basic ways, requiring constant attendance from servants and physicians. Yet still, he would not abdicate. Still, he would not abandon his kingdom, understanding that his departure from the scene would likely trigger the very succession crisis he had worked so hard to prevent. In late 1184, Saladin once again besieged Kerak, demonstrating his persistent determination to eliminate this strategic fortress from Christian control. Once again, Baldwin IV, now so weak that he was described as being at the point of death, had himself carried on his litter to lead the relief force. The very fact that the king, obviously dying, would still insist on accompanying the army says everything about his sense of duty and his refusal to abandon his responsibilities even at the threshold of death. The second relief of Kerak followed much the same pattern as the first. Saladin, hearing that Baldwin's army was approaching, chose to lift the siege rather than risk a battle. Kerak was saved once more, though everyone involved must have understood that this reprieve was likely temporary. Saladin could afford to try again and again, but the Crusader kingdom had only limited resources and a king who clearly did not have much time left. Throughout 1184, Baldwin continued to govern as best he could, making decisions about appointments, hearing disputes, and trying to maintain order among the fractious nobility. But the physical suffering he endured was terrible. Contemporary accounts describe him as being in constant pain, his flesh corrupted by disease, his body essentially falling apart, while his mind remained trapped within it, still aware, still thinking, still responsible for a kingdom that desperately needed strong leadership. The political situation within the kingdom during this period was increasingly tense. Guy de Lusignan, though officially excluded from power, was still married to Sibylla and still had supporters among the nobility, particularly the Templars and some of the newer arrivals from Europe, who did not share the older family's suspicion of him. Raymond of Tripoli represented the moderate faction, the established nobles who favoured careful diplomacy balanced with military strength. Reynald of Châtillon led the Hawks, those who advocated for aggressive action against Saladin regardless of diplomatic consequences. Baldwin tried to maintain balance among these factions, but his physical weakness made this increasingly difficult. The king, who had once been able to personally lead armies and impose his will through his presence on the battlefield, was now a blind, bedridden invalid who could exercise authority only through the force of his legitimate status and the respect his previous actions had earned. It was a testament to the strength of the Crusader kingdom's governmental structures that Baldwin was able to govern at all under these circumstances. In early 1185, Baldwin IV made his final arrangements for the kingdom's governance after his death. He confirmed Raymond of Tripoli as regent for young Baldwin V, established the terms under which the regency would operate, and tried to secure promises from the various factions that they would accept these arrangements. He also made efforts to have Sibylla's marriage to Guy annulled and to have Guy deprived of his fief of Ascalon, recognizing that Guy posed a continuing threat to the kingdom's stability. However, Guy and Sibylla refused to cooperate, and the king lacked the physical strength to force the issue. As winter turned to spring in 1185, it became clear that Baldwin V was approaching the end. He had reigned for 11 years from age 13 to age 24, an extraordinary accomplishment given his disease and the challenges he faced. He had defended his kingdom against one of the greatest military leaders of the age, had won stunning victories against overwhelming odds, had maintained his authority despite physical disabilities that would have forced most people into helpless dependence, and had done everything in his power to secure the kingdom's future after his death. In the early spring of 1185, Baldwin IV's long struggle against leprosy finally approached its conclusion. The exact date of his death is not recorded in the chronicles, but it occurred sometime before May 16, 1185, as documents from that date refer to him in the past tense. He was 24 years old, having lived far longer with leprosy than most medical experts of his time would have predicted, and having accomplished far more than anyone would have thought possible for someone with his affliction. The circumstances of Baldwin's death were likely marked by the same dignity and courage that had characterized his life. He would have been attended by physicians and priests, surrounded by family members and loyal retainers. The rituals of the church would have been observed, with the last rites administered to prepare his soul for the journey ahead. For a man who had suffered so terribly in his physical body, death may well have come as a relief, a final release from pain and disability. Baldwin IV was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the holiest site in Christendom, built over the place where Christian tradition holds that Jesus Christ was crucified and buried. To be interred in this sacred space was an honor reserved for the most important figures of the Crusader kingdom, and Baldwin's burial there testified to the respect and admiration he had earned despite his illness. His tomb lay near those of his father Amalric and his grandfather Fulk, continuing the line of Jerusalem's kings in death as he had in life. The death of Baldwin IV left the kingdom of Jerusalem in the hands of his nephew, the young Baldwin V, with Raymond of Tripoli serving as regent according to the arrangements the late king had made. For a brief moment, it seemed that Baldwin IV's careful planning might ensure a smooth transition and continued stability for the kingdom. Young Baldwin V was the legitimate king, crowned while his uncle lived, and Raymond was experienced and competent. But fate had more cruelty in store for the kingdom of Jerusalem. Young Baldwin V, who had been a sickly child throughout his short life, survived his uncle by barely a year. In the summer of 1186, at the age of about 9, the boy king died, possibly of the same disease that had killed so many children in that era, dysentery, fever, or one of the countless ailments that medieval medicine could not cure. With his death, the succession crisis that Baldwin IV had worked so desperately to prevent finally arrived in full force. The arrangements that Baldwin IV had put in place called for the succession question to be referred to the great powers of Europe, the Pope, the kings of France and England, the Holy Roman Emperor. But this would take time, and the kingdom could not afford to wait months or years for these distant rulers to come to a decision. Immediate action was necessary, and into this vacuum of legitimate authority stepped Sibylla and her supporters. In a dramatic series of events in late summer 1186, Jocelyn of Courtenay, Baldwin IV's uncle and Sibylla's uncle, effectively staged a coup. He tricked Raymond of Tripoli into leaving Jerusalem, then moved quickly to have Sibylla crowned as queen. The coronation was conducted by Patriarch Heraclius, who had been a supporter of the Courtenay faction, and it presented the other nobles with a fait accompli. Sibylla was now the anointed queen, regardless of the procedural irregularities. The nobles who opposed Guy de Lusignan, knowing that Sibylla's coronation would likely lead to Guy becoming king, extracted a promise from her that she would annul her marriage to Guy before accepting the crown. Sibylla agreed to this condition and was crowned queen. But then, in a move that her supporters must have planned in advance, she exercised her right as queen to choose her own husband. To the shock and dismay of those who had opposed Guy, Sibylla chose to remarry Guy immediately and then crowned him as king herself. Guy de Lusignan thus became king of Jerusalem through his wife's inheritance and her loyalty to him, despite all the efforts that Baldwin IV had made to prevent this outcome. The man whose military incompetence had been demonstrated beyond doubt, whom Baldwin IV had stripped of authority and excluded from the succession, now wore the crown of Jerusalem. The kingdom that Baldwin IV had defended so bravely and governed so carefully was now in the hands of someone completely unsuited to the challenges ahead. With Guy de Lusignan as king and Sibylla as queen, the kingdom of Jerusalem entered what would be its final phase as a viable state. The kingdom that had been founded with the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, that had survived for nearly 90 years, that had weathered countless military challenges and political crises, was about to face its greatest disaster, one from which it would never fully recover. The crisis came to a head in 1187. Reynald of Chatillon, still serving as Lord of Kerak and still pursuing his aggressive policies toward Muslim targets, attacked yet another Muslim caravan. This time, the caravan included Saladin's own sister, though accounts differ as to whether she was actually harmed in the attack. Regardless of the exact details, Saladin had the perfect pretext for launching a full-scale invasion. He had already sworn years earlier that he would personally kill Reynald, and now he had fresh justification for war. Saladin assembled the largest army he had ever commanded, drawing forces from Egypt, Syria, and all the territories under his control. The exact numbers are disputed by historians, with estimates ranging from 20,000 to 40,000 men, but it was certainly a massive force, far larger than the army the Kingdom of Jerusalem could field. This was to be Saladin's great push to finally destroy the Crusader states and recapture Jerusalem for Islam. King Guy called up every available man to face this threat. The Christian army that assembled included knights from all the baronies, contingents from both the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, and infantry levies from the towns. The total force was perhaps 20,000 men, including about 200 to 1,500 heavy cavalry, the elite mounted knights who were the core of Crusader military power. This represented nearly the entire military strength of the kingdom, leaving the cities and castles dangerously under-garrisoned. The campaign that followed would reveal Guy de Lusignan's incompetence with terrible clarity. Saladin besieged the city of Tiberias, on the Sea of Galilee, whose garrison was commanded by the wife of Raymond of Tripoli. The strategic question facing the Christian leadership was whether to march to relieve Tiberias, or to remain at their current position, near a spring at Sephoria, where they had access to water. Raymond of Tripoli, whose wife was in the besieged city, nonetheless urged that the army should remain at Sephoria. He argued that Saladin's army, which was much larger, could not maintain itself in the field indefinitely. The Muslim soldiers would need to return to their homes and lands eventually, and if the Christian army remained in a strong defensive position with access to water, they could wait out the siege without risking a battle on unfavorable terms. Even if Tiberias fell, it could be recaptured later. The important thing was to preserve the army, which was the kingdom's only real defense. This advice was militarily sound, representing the same kind of cautious, defensive strategy that Baldwin IV had often employed when facing overwhelming odds. But Guy de Lusignan, perhaps remembering the criticism he had received in 1183 when he failed to engage Saladin's forces, or perhaps simply making another disastrous decision, chose to ignore Raymond's counsel. He ordered the army to march to relieve Tiberias. The march was conducted in the height of summer, across dry and barren terrain, with the heavy armored knights and foot soldiers burdened by their equipment and suffering terribly from heat and thirst. Saladin's light cavalry harassed the column constantly, shooting arrows and then retreating before the Crusaders could engage them effectively. The Christian army made slow progress, constantly under attack, unable to find water, with morale deteriorating with each passing hour. By July 3rd, 1187, the Christian army had only progressed partway to Tiberias and was desperate for water. Guy decided to camp for the night near a pair of hills called the Horns of Hattin, hoping to resume the march in the morning. But the army was now trapped, too far from Tiberias to reach it quickly, too far from Sephoria to retreat to safety, and with no water source nearby. The soldiers spent a miserable night, tormented by thirst, knowing that they would have to fight the next day without being able to slake their desperate need for water. On the morning of July 4th, 1187, Saladin's forces attacked the Christian army at the Horns of Hattin. The Muslim forces surrounded the Crusaders, cutting off any chance of retreat. Saladin's archers poured volleys of arrows into the Christian formations, while his cavalry struck at any weak points they could find. The Christians tried repeatedly to break through the encirclement, mounting desperate cavalry charges that were beaten back each time. The battle became a massacre. The Christian infantry, maddened by thirst and seeing no hope of a victory, broke and tried to surrender or flee. Many were cut down, others were captured. The knights fought on with desperate courage, but they were exhausted, dehydrated, and overwhelmed by superior numbers. By afternoon, organized resistance had collapsed. King Guy and most of the surviving nobles were captured. Reynold of Chatillon was brought before Saladin personally, and the Sultan, remembering his oath, executed Reynold with his own hand. The Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Gerard de Ridefort, was captured along with most of his knights. Nearly all the Templar and Hospitaller knights who survived the battle were subsequently executed on Saladin's orders, as he viewed these military religious orders as particularly dangerous enemies. The true cross, a relic believed to contain wood from the cross on which Jesus was crucified and which the Bishop of Acre had carried into battle, was captured by Saladin's forces. This was seen as a devastating spiritual blow to Christendom, the loss of one of Christianity's most sacred relics. The disaster at Hattin was total. The kingdom of Jerusalem had lost its army. Its king was a prisoner. Most of its great nobles were dead or captured, and the castles and cities were left virtually defenseless. In the weeks and months following the battle, Saladin's forces swept through the Crusader territories, capturing city after city, castle after castle. Acre fell, then Jaffa, then Ascalon, then dozens of smaller fortifications. Only a handful of strongly fortified positions like Tyre managed to hold out. On September 20th, 1187, Saladin laid siege to Jerusalem itself. The city was defended by Balian of Ibelin, one of the few nobles to escape capture at Hattin, along with Queen Sibylla and Patriarch Heraclius. But the garrison was small. The walls were difficult to fully man, and there was little hope of relief. After less than 2 weeks of siege, Baldwin negotiated the surrender of the city on October 2nd, 1187. Saladin, demonstrating the chivalry for which he was famous, allowed the Christian inhabitants to ransom themselves and leave the city, rather than suffering the massacre that the Muslims had endured when the Crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099. Those who could pay the ransom left safely, though many poor Christians who could not pay were sold into slavery. Jerusalem was once again under Muslim control, a situation that would last, with brief interruptions, for more than 7 centuries. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. Pope Gregory VIII issued a call for a new crusade even before he learned that the city had actually fallen, based just on the news of the disaster at Hattin. This call would lead to the Third Crusade, led by 3 of the most powerful monarchs in Europe: Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick I Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. But that is another story. The catastrophic events of 1187, the Battle of Hattin, and the fall of Jerusalem occurred just 2 years after Baldwin IV's death. These disasters have led many historians to wonder what might have happened if Baldwin had lived longer, or if his arrangements for the succession had been followed. Would Baldwin IV, despite his physical limitations, have made better decisions than Guy de Lusignan? Almost certainly yes. Would he have marched the army into the trap at Hattin? Almost certainly no. Baldwin IV had repeatedly demonstrated military competence even when physically incapacitated. At Montgisard in 1177, he had defeated Saladin decisively through bold tactical action at the right moment. In the various campaigns of the early 1180s, he had shown an understanding of when to fight and when to avoid battle. When he had himself carried on a litter to relieve Kerak in 1183 and 1184, he demonstrated that even complete physical disability did not prevent him from exercising effective military leadership. Moreover, Baldwin had shown political skill in managing the fractious nobility of the kingdom. He had balanced factions, made difficult decisions about succession and appointments, and maintained the unity of the realm despite constant challenges. Guy de Lusignan, by contrast, had no such political skills. The march to Hattin occurred in part because Guy could not maintain the confidence of his nobles and felt compelled to prove his martial courage through reckless action. The comparison between Baldwin IV and Guy de Lusignan is stark and tragic. Baldwin, a teenager dying of leprosy, who should have been helpless, proved to be an effective war leader and a capable king. Guy, a healthy adult knight with military training, proved to be incompetent and disastrous. If Baldwin's succession arrangements had held, if young Baldwin V had lived to maturity, or if the decision had been referred to the European powers as Baldwin IV had intended, the catastrophe of 1187 might have been avoided or at least mitigated. This has led some historians to see Baldwin IV as one of the great might-have-been figures of history. If not for his disease, if he had been able to live a normal lifespan and produce heirs, the history of the Crusader states might have been very different. A strong, capable king on the throne of Jerusalem in 1187 might have made the strategic decisions necessary to avoid the disaster at Hattin. At the very least, such a king would not have made the catastrophically bad decisions that Guy made. Baldwin's reputation has endured through the centuries, with both Christian and Muslim sources treating him with respect and even admiration. William of Tyre, his tutor and the primary contemporary chronicler, wrote about him with evident affection and sorrow, portraying him as a tragic hero who did his duty despite terrible suffering. Muslim chroniclers, including those close to Saladin, acknowledged Baldwin as a formidable opponent who had repeatedly frustrated the Sultan's plans. In later centuries, Baldwin IV became a figure of legend and inspiration. Medieval and early modern Christian writers held him up as an example of courage in the face of adversity, of duty persevering despite physical suffering, the romantic image of the Leper King, fighting valiantly despite his disease, appealed to the medieval love of tragic nobility and sacrificial heroism. In more modern times, Baldwin IV has been the subject of scholarly biographies, most notably Bernard Hamilton's The Leper King and His Heirs, which provides a detailed and sympathetic analysis of his reign. The book demonstrates that far from being merely a tragic figure, Baldwin was a shrewd political operator and a capable military leader who made generally sound decisions given the extraordinarily difficult circumstances he faced. Popular culture has also discovered Baldwin IV, most notably in the 2005 film Kingdom of Heaven, directed by Ridley Scott. In the film, Edward Norton portrays Baldwin, though always masked and never showing his face, emphasizing the king's disease and his determination to maintain peace and protect Jerusalem. While the film takes significant historical liberties and simplifies many complex political situations, it does capture something essential about Baldwin: his courage, his commitment to his kingdom, and his awareness that time was running out for him personally. Baldwin IV's life raises profound questions about leadership, courage, and human potential. How was it possible for a teenage boy, with one of history's most feared diseases, to function as an effective king? How did he maintain authority and command respect when his physical condition should have rendered him helpless? How did he find the strength to continue ruling when his body was failing and when death was a constant companion? Part of the answer lies in Baldwin's personal qualities: his intelligence, his courage, his sense of duty, and his refusal to surrender to despair despite every reason to do so. Part lies in the support he received from capable advisors and loyal followers who recognized his legitimacy and who chose to follow him despite his limitations. And part lies in the structures of medieval kingship, which gave an anointed monarch an authority that transcended physical capability. Baldwin also benefited from the particular circumstances of the Crusader kingdoms, which had developed somewhat different attitudes toward leprosy than prevailed in Western Europe. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was home to the Order of St. Lazarus, a military order specifically for leper knights, demonstrating that even lepers could serve the defense of the realm. The presence of this order and the kingdom's experience with leprosy may have made Baldwin's subjects more willing to accept a leper king than would have been the case in Europe. As we reach the end of this long journey through the life of Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, we return to the essential mystery and miracle of his existence. Here was a young man who should have been cast out of society, who by all the conventions of his time should have been forced into a leper colony to live out his remaining days in isolation and despair. Instead, he wore a crown, commanded armies, defeated one of the greatest generals of his age in battle, and maintained the defense of the Kingdom of Jerusalem for more than a decade. Baldwin's reign lasted 11 years, from July 1174, when he was crowned at age 13, until his death in spring 1185, at age 24. These 11 years were filled with constant challenges: military threats from Saladin, political intrigues among the nobility, the relentless progression of his disease, and the overwhelming burden of knowing that he was dying, and that the succession he left behind would determine whether his kingdom survived or collapsed. Through all of these challenges, Baldwin maintained his commitment to his kingdom and his people. He never abdicated, never surrendered to despair, never used his illness as an excuse to avoid his responsibilities. He fought when fighting was necessary, negotiated when negotiation was wise, made difficult political decisions, and tried with every resource at his disposal to secure the kingdom's future after his death. His greatest triumphs, particularly the stunning victory at Montgisard in 1177, demonstrated that courage and determination could overcome tremendous odds. His willingness to have himself carried into battle on a litter when he was blind and unable to walk showed a dedication to duty that bordered on the superhuman. His political skill in managing the succession crisis and attempting to prevent Guy de Lusignan from destroying the kingdom showed that his mind remained sharp even as his body failed, that his efforts ultimately proved insufficient, that the kingdom fell to pieces within 2 years of his death, does not diminish Baldwin's achievement. He could only work with the materials at hand, the nobles who were available, the political structures of the Crusader states, the military and economic resources of a small kingdom surrounded by enemies. He made the best decisions he could with the information available to him. That Guy de Lusignan proved to be even more incompetent than anyone expected. That young Baldwin V died before reaching maturity. That the disasters of 1187 unfolded as they did. These were not Baldwin IV's failures. He did everything possible to prevent these outcomes. Baldwin IV's life speaks to the enduring human capacity to transcend physical limitations through strength of character. His story reminds us that leadership is not primarily about physical prowess or perfect health, but about judgment, courage, and dedication to something larger than oneself. It demonstrates that dignity and nobility can exist even in the midst of terrible suffering, and that duty can sustain someone through trials that would seem unbearable. For those of us listening to this story as we drift towards sleep, Baldwin IV's life offers both inspiration and melancholy reflection. His courage in the face of certain death, his refusal to abandon his responsibilities despite overwhelming physical challenges, his determination to leave his kingdom in better condition than he found it. These are qualities that resonate across the centuries, speaking to something fundamental about human nobility and the capacity to endure. As you close your eyes and let sleep take you, imagine the golden walls of Jerusalem in the late 12th century, the Crusader kingdom in its final years of strength before the disasters that would transform it forever. Imagine a young king, his body ravaged by disease, his face hidden behind bandages or perhaps not hidden at all, sitting in judgment, making decisions, trying to hold together a realm that was always on the edge of dissolution. Imagine him being carried on a litter through the hot Palestinian sun, the army marching around him, everyone knowing that their king could not see the battlefield, could not raise a sword, could barely even communicate his orders, yet following him anyway, because he was the anointed king, because he had proven his courage, because his very presence in that litter demonstrated the kind of determination and sacrifice that inspired men to follow. And imagine him finally finding rest, after years of pain and struggle, laid to rest in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, his suffering ended, his duty fulfilled as well as mortal man could fulfill it. He was 24 years old, had reigned for 11 years, had accomplished more than anyone thought possible, and had left behind a legacy that would be remembered for centuries to come. Baldwin IV, the Leper King of Jerusalem, ruled from 1174 to 1185, defeated Saladin at Montgisard, protected his kingdom against overwhelming odds, and demonstrated that the human spirit can triumph over physical limitation through courage, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to duty. His story is one of the most remarkable in medieval history, a testament to what one person can accomplish even when facing seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Let his courage comfort you as you drift into dreams. Let his determination inspire you when you face challenges in your own life. And let his memory serve as a reminder that greatness can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, that strength is not only physical, and that the noblest legacy we can leave is the knowledge that we did our duty to the best of our ability, regardless of the cost. Good night, dear listener. May you rest as peacefully as Baldwin IV finally rests, his struggles ended, his duty fulfilled, his place in history secure. Sleep well.